Black soldiers refused a degrading order to protect Japanese women. In the steaming jungles of the Philippines, 1945, where war had already taken so much, a white lieutenant commands his black squad to strip down, in front of traumatized women who've already suffered unspeakable abuse. 5 soldiers exchange glances in the heavy silence. Their hearts pound with the weight of what comes next. "We won't take our clothes off," the sergeant says quietly. One refusal. One moment of dignity offered to those who'd been shown none. The military machine grinds to a halt. Court-martial threatens. Careers hang in the balance. The women watch, confused by this unexpected mercy. As punishment spreads to every man who stood their ground, something unexpected grows in the shadow of their sacrifice. What happens when soldiers choose humanity over orders? And in a segregated army fighting for freedom, who truly carries the weight of America's promise? The jungle dripped. Dawn hadn't broken yet, but the air was already thick with moisture that beaded on leaves and rolled down the necks of exhausted men. Northern Luzon's mountains cut jagged lines against the pale sky as Sergeant Isaiah Coleman wiped mud from his face and took stock of his squad. 6 men, all bone-tired, their uniforms stiff with sweat and grime. They'd spent the night in a firefight with Japanese stragglers, pinned down by sporadic rifle fire until around 3 in the morning. Now they were sweeping a ridge to make sure the area was secure. "Jones, how you holding up?" Coleman asked, his voice low as they moved between massive tree trunks draped with vines. Private Jones adjusted his helmet. "Been better, Sarge. Been worse too," Coleman nodded. That was about all you could hope for out here. Jones had taken shrapnel in his shoulder 2 months ago, but insisted on returning to the squad early. Coleman understood why. Being separated from your unit was sometimes worse than the wound itself. "Keep it tight," Pullman whispered as they approached a clearing. "Washington, Taylor, check our flanks." The men moved with practiced coordination. They'd been fighting together for months now, part of the 93rd Infantry Division, the Blue Helmets, one of the few all-black combat units the Army had finally allowed to fight. Private Washington, the youngest of the group at barely 20, signaled with his hand. Something ahead. Coleman crept forward, rifle ready. Through a screen of vegetation, he spotted a small bamboo hut. Half its roof collapsed. Smoke damage darkened one wall. The door hung crooked on leather hinges. "Taylor, Miller, cover us," Coleman whispered. "Washington, Jones, with me." The 3 men advanced slowly toward the hut, every sense straining. Birds called overhead and insects buzzed, but there was no human sound. Coleman reached the doorway first. The dim interior smelled of charred wood, fear, and unwashed bodies. As his eyes adjusted, shapes huddled in the far corner resolved into human forms. Women. 5 of them, crouched together like wounded animals. They wore torn, dirty clothing. Bruises marked their faces and arms. Their eyes held the hollow stare of people who had seen too much horror to believe in safety anymore. Japanese civilians, Coleman realized. Young women. "Sarge," Washington whispered beside him, rifle lowered but ready. Coleman raised his hand slowly, making a calming gesture toward the women. "It's okay. We won't hurt you." The women pressed themselves tighter against the wall. One whimpered something in Japanese. Another, slightly older with a makeshift bandage around her forearm, whispered urgently to the others. "Miller," Coleman called softly over his shoulder, "get Richards up here. He knows some Japanese." The women tensed at the new voice. The oldest couldn't have been more than 25. The youngest looked barely 16. Private Richards appeared moments later, crouching beside Coleman. "What have we got, Sarge?" "Japanese women. Civilians, looks like. Try talking to them." Richards nodded, then spoke a few halting phrases. The women exchanged glances, and the one with the bandaged arm responded hesitantly. "They're scared out of their minds, Sarge," Richards said. "Think they've been here about 2 weeks. Before that," his face darkened. They were held at a Japanese camp nearby. As, comfort women. Coleman's jaw tightened. He'd heard about this. Women forced into sexual slavery for Japanese soldiers. The bruises, the fear, it all made sickening sense now. "Tell them we're Americans," Coleman said. "We're here to help." Richards translated. The women's expressions didn't change. "They don't understand the difference," Richards said quietly. "To them, we're just more soldiers." The sound of boots approaching made Coleman turn. Lieutenant Markham, their white commanding officer, ducked through the doorway. His uniform was crisp compared to the mud-caked gear of Coleman's squad. Markham had stayed at the command post during the night's fighting. "Report, Sergeant," Markham said, his eyes sweeping the hut. "Sir, 5 Japanese female civilians. They appear to be former comfort women from a nearby camp." Markham's gaze lingered on the women. Something in his expression made Coleman uneasy. Not sympathy, something colder. "Their condition, Sergeant?" "Malnourished, injured, traumatized." Markham nodded slowly. "We'll need to process them. Might have useful intelligence." The word process hung in the air. Coleman knew what it meant. The women would be taken to an interrogation center, treated as potential enemy assets rather than victims. "Sir, they need medical attention," Coleman said. Markham's eyes flicked to Coleman, narrowed slightly. "I'm aware of protocol, Sergeant." He paused. "Have the men assemble outside. We'll need a sanitary inspection before proceeding." Coleman stiffened. "Sir, sanitary inspection, Sergeant. The men have been in the jungle for days. Can't have disease spreading." Markham turned and ducked out of the hut. Coleman exchanged a look with Richards. Sanitary inspections weren't unusual, but the timing felt wrong. Something about Markham's expression, the way he'd looked at the women, set off warning bells. "Tell them we'll get them food and water," Coleman said to Richards. "Tell them to stay put for now." Richards nodded and spoke again in Japanese. The women didn't respond except for the slightest nod from the one with the bandaged arm. Her eyes met Coleman's for a brief moment. They held no trust, only the weary resignation of someone who had learned that kindness usually came with a price. The clearing outside the hut was small, dappled with early morning light filtering through the jungle canopy. Coleman's squad gathered in a loose semicircle. "Lieutenant." Markham stood with his back to the hut, hands clasped behind him. "Squad, attention," Coleman called. The men straightened, rifles at their sides. From the doorway of the hut, the Japanese women watched. The one with the bandaged arm had helped the others to the entrance, where they could see what was happening. Their faces were expressionless masks, but their eyes darted nervously between the soldiers. "Men," Markham began, his voice carrying the crisp authority of West Point. "We have potential intelligence assets here. Before we process them, we need to ensure proper hygiene. Remove your uniforms down to your undergarments for inspection." A stunned silence fell over the clearing. Coleman felt a cold knot form in his stomach. This wasn't standard procedure. Not here, not now, with traumatized women watching. It was humiliation, pure and simple. The men exchanged confused glances. Private Washington's young face flushed dark with shame. Private Miller stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. Coleman looked back at the women. Their expressions had changed. Fear mixed with resignation. They'd seen this before, or something like it. They were preparing themselves for what they believed would come next. In that moment, Coleman understood. Markham wasn't just humiliating his men. He was terrorizing the women, confirming their worst fears about what soldiers, any soldiers, would do to them. Heat rose in Coleman's chest. His hands began to tremble, not with fear, but with a controlled rage that made his vision sharpen. Time seemed to slow as he stepped forward. "Sir," he said, his voice leveled despite the pounding in his chest, "we won't take our clothes off." Markham turned slowly, his face a mask of disbelief. "What did you say, Sergeant?" "I said we won't take our clothes off, sir." Coleman stood perfectly still. "Not in front of these women." The clearing went silent. Even the jungle insects seemed to pause. The men of the squad stood frozen, eyes wide with shock at what their sergeant had just done. Markham's face darkened. "That's an order, Sergeant Coleman." "It's not a lawful order, sir." Coleman didn't raise his voice. "These women have been abused. They're terrified. This will only traumatize them further. I don't recall asking for your opinion on psychological matters, Sergeant." Markham's voice had dropped dangerously low. "I gave you an order." Coleman could feel sweat trickling down his back. Insubordination, court-martial offense. Everything he'd worked for in the army, gone in an instant. But the women's eyes on his back steeled his resolve. "The men need to be checked for jungle rot and lice," Markham continued, addressing the squad now. "This is standard procedure. Remove your uniforms." Nobody moved. "That's an order." Markham's voice cracked like a whip. Coleman glanced back. His squad stood still, faces grim but determined. They'd made their choice. From the hut doorway, there was a small sound. The woman with the bandaged arm had stepped forward slightly. She was staring at Coleman with something new in her eyes. Confusion, disbelief. Markham's pale face had flushed red. He pulled out a small notepad and pencil. "I'm documenting this insubordination, Sergeant. You and your men will face charges." "Yes, sir," Coleman replied steadily. "Davis," Markham called to his radio operator who stood at the edge of the clearing. "Contact the nearest MP post. Tell them we need an escort." Davis hesitated, then moved to the field radio. The women whispered among themselves, their eyes never leaving Coleman's back. The older one said something that made the others go silent. They were trying to understand what was happening, why these soldiers were acting differently than any they had encountered before. The sun had fully risen now, casting long shadows through the clearing. Coleman's squad remained at attention while Markham paced, waiting for a response from the MPs. The Japanese women had settled just inside the doorway of the hut, watching the standoff with wary confusion. Davis approached Markham. "Sir, MP escort will arrive in approximately 1 hour. Supply convoy passing nearby has 2 military police who can divert to our position." Markham nodded curtly. "Have them prepare to transport prisoners." "Yes, sir." Davis retreated to the radio. "At ease," Markham said to the squad. "Maintain positions in the clearing. No one speaks to the civilians." He walked to the opposite side of the clearing and began writing in his notepad, occasionally glancing up with thinly veiled contempt. Coleman gave a slight nod to his men. They relaxed marginally, but remained clustered together. Private Miller sidled closer to Coleman. "Sarge," he whispered, "what are they going to do to us?" Coleman kept his eyes forward. "Likely court-martial. Insubordination during wartime operations." "But the order was wrong," Washington murmured, his young face twisted with worry. "You can't make people strip down in front of women who've been, you know." "Army doesn't always see things the way we do," Coleman replied quietly. Richards glanced toward the hut. "The women are talking about us, trying to figure out what's happening." "What are they saying?" Coleman asked. "The older one, her name is Emmy. She thinks we refused because we're planning something worse." Richards shook his head. "She doesn't understand we're trying to protect their dignity," Coleman sighed. Of course they wouldn't understand. How could they, after what they'd been through? Jones shifted his weight, wincing at the pain in his injured shoulder. "Worth it, though," he said softly. "Some things a man can't do, even if ordered." Miller nodded. "My mama would skin me alive if I stripped down in front of women like that, no matter who gave the order." A grim chuckle passed through the group. "Listen," Coleman said, his voice barely audible. "Whatever happens, we stick together. We tell the truth. The order was inappropriate and harmful to traumatize civilians. That's all." The men nodded. "What about the women?" Taylor asked. "What'll happen to them?" Coleman looked toward the hut. The women still watched, their faces unreadable. "They'll be processed through intelligence, then probably sent to a civilian camp until the war ends." "Processed through intelligence," Miller repeated bitterly. "You know what that means for women like them." Coleman did know. More men in uniform asking questions, not caring about their trauma. More fear, more distrust. "We did what we could," Coleman said, though the words felt hollow even to him. A soft sound made them all turn. The woman called Emmy had taken a tentative step out of the hut, a cracked bowl in her hands. She said something to Richards. "She's asking if they can have water," Richards translated. Before Coleman could respond, Markham called out, "No contact with the civilians, Sergeant." Coleman looked at Markham, then back at Emmy. "Tell her yes," he said to Richards. Then, louder, "Sir, they need water. Basic humanitarian aid." Markham's jaw worked as he considered. "Fine. Miller, fetch water. No other communication." Miller took his canteen and carefully approached Emmy, who shrank back slightly but held her ground. He poured water into her bowl, then stepped away. Emmy retreated to share the water with the others. The distant rumble of an engine broke the tense silence. Everyone turned toward the jungle path that led to their position. "MPs," Washington muttered. But instead of the expected jeep, a small convoy of 3 vehicles emerged from the trees. 2 ambulances and a supply truck with a red cross painted on its canvas top. A medical convoy. Relief flooded through Coleman. Medical personnel operated under different priorities than line officers like Markham. They might provide a buffer, at least for the women. The lead ambulance stopped at the edge of the clearing. The driver jumped out and opened the passenger door. A woman in an Army Nurse Corps uniform stepped down, adjusting her cap over neatly pinned dark hair. She surveyed the scene with quick professional eyes, then spotted the Japanese women in the doorway of the hut. Lieutenant Markham strode toward the ambulance. "I didn't request medical support." The nurse saluted crisply. "Lieutenant Lucille Garner, sir. 33rd 2nd Medical Battalion. We're routing to the forward aid station and received notification of civilians needing medical attention." Coleman recognized the unit designation, one of the few black medical units serving in the Pacific. Garner's dark skin confirmed it. Markham frowned. "These civilians are being processed as potential intelligence assets, Lieutenant. They'll receive medical screening at the detention facility." Garner's expression remained professional, but her eyes hardened slightly. "Sir, I have orders to evaluate all civilians encountered by forward units. Standard procedure for humanitarian compliance." She gestured, and 2 male medics began unloading supplies from the ambulance. "These civilians may have information vital to operations," Markham insisted. "They need to be processed through intelligence first." "Huh? They won't be much use to intelligence if they're suffering from malnutrition, infection, or worse, sir," Garner replied evenly. "I'll conduct a preliminary examination and provide emergency care. Then they're all yours." She turned away before Markham could respond, effectively ending the discussion. Coleman had to suppress a smile at the lieutenant's momentary speechlessness. Medical personnel could sometimes get away with what infantry couldn't. Garner approached the hut slowly, hands visible, speaking softly. "I'm a nurse. I'm here to help. Does anyone understand English?" The women huddled together, watching warily. Emmy shook her head. "Richards," Coleman called, "can you translate for the medical team?" Richards looked to Markham for permission. After a moment of visible frustration, Markham nodded curtly. Richards moved toward the hut, speaking gently in Japanese. Emmy responded hesitantly. "She says the youngest one has a fever," Richards reported to Garner. "And they're all hungry. Haven't eaten properly in days." Garner nodded, maintaining a respectful distance. "Tell them I'm going to examine them one by one. Just a basic check for now. They're safe." As Richards translated, Garner turned to Coleman. "Sergeant, what's your unit?" 93rd Infantry Division, 25th Regiment, ma'am." Sergeant Isaiah Coleman. Something flickered in her eyes. Recognition of another black soldier in this segregated army. "What's the situation here, Sergeant? Besides the obvious." Coleman hesitated, aware of Markham watching them. "We found these women during a sweep after engaging enemy forces. They appear to be former comfort women from a nearby Japanese camp." Garner's expression tightened with understanding. "I see. And the current standoff I've walked into?" Before Coleman could answer, the sound of another engine approached. A jeep carrying 2 military police officers pulled into the clearing. "That would be for me, ma'am," Coleman said quietly, "and my men." Lieutenant Garner worked efficiently, with Richards translating. She had coaxed the women further into the hut where she could examine them with some privacy. Coleman's squad remained in the clearing, now under the watchful eyes of the 2 MPs who stood near Markham. The MPs, both white, had been briefed by Markham and now regarded Coleman's squad with stern suspicion. One was older, with a weathered face and sergeant's stripes. The other barely older than Washington, his holster unsnapped. "You men really refuse a direct order?" the MP sergeant asked, shaking his head. "Not too bright." Coleman didn't respond. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make things worse. From inside the hut came Garner's calm voice as she worked. "Richards, ask her when she last ate. Yes, that's infected, but we can treat it. Tell her this won't hurt. Just cleaning the wound." The younger MP shifted uncomfortably in the heat. "Lieutenant says you refused a sanitary inspection. That true?" Washington opened his mouth, but Coleman silenced him with a look. "We're not discussing the incident until formal charges are filed," Coleman said evenly. The MP sergeant snorted. "Smart. Won't help, but smart." He mopped his brow with a handkerchief. "Gonna be a long, hot wait for you boys." "Transport won't arrive until tomorrow morning." Markham paced at the edge of the clearing, occasionally speaking into the field radio. His back was rigid with barely contained anger. After about 30 minutes, Garner emerged from the hut, medical bag in hand. Her face was composed, but her eyes blazed as she strode directly to Markham. "Lieutenant, a word, please." Markham turned, frowning at her tone. "What is it, Lieutenant?" "Privately, sir." Garner gestured away from the group. With visible reluctance, Markham followed her several paces into the jungle's edge. Their conversation was hushed but intense. Garner's gestures became increasingly emphatic, while Markham's posture grew more defensive. Coleman couldn't hear their words, but he could guess the content. Garner had seen the women's condition and drawn her own conclusions about their treatment. After several minutes, they returned. Markham's face was flushed, his mouth a tight line. Garner looked grimly satisfied. "Sergeant Coleman," Markham said stiffly, "your squad will assist the medical team in establishing temporary shelter for these civilians." Coleman blinked in surprise. "Yes, sir." "The military police will remain to ensure proper procedure is followed." Markham glared at Garner. "The civilians will be transported to the collection point tomorrow as ordered, Lieutenant. I'm simply allowing basic medical stabilization first." "Of course, sir," Garner replied with cool professionalism. "As per standard humanitarian protocols." She turned to Coleman. "Sergeant, I need a shelter set up adjacent to the hut. These women need fresh air and sunlight, but they're too frightened to be moved far. Can your men construct something simple?" "Yes, ma'am. Right away." Coleman turned to his squad. "Washington, Jones, gather bamboo poles from the perimeter. Taylor, Miller, find broad leaves for a roof covering. Richards, stay with Lieutenant Garner to translate." The men moved quickly, relieved to have purposeful work instead of standing in the tense clearing. The MPs watched, but made no move to interfere. As the squad dispersed, Garner approached Coleman. "Walk with me to the ambulance, Sergeant. I need supplies." Once they were out of earshot of Markham and the MPs, Garner spoke quietly. "Those women are severely traumatized, malnourished, and 2 have infections that need immediate treatment. What happened here before I arrived?" Coleman hesitated, then answered honestly. "Lieutenant Markham ordered my squad to strip to our underwear for a sanitary inspection, in front of the women." Garner stopped walking, her face registering shock, then understanding. "And you refused?" "Yes, ma'am. We all did." She studied him for a long moment. "Those women believe you refused because you're planning something worse later. They don't understand." "I know," Coleman said quietly. "One of them, Emmy, told me they were held at a comfort station for over a year. When the Japanese troops retreated, they were abandoned. They've been hiding ever since, terrified of being found." Coleman nodded grimly. "That matches what we pieced together." Garner resumed walking. "I've bought us some time." Markham wanted them moved immediately, but I convinced him they need medical stabilization first. She glanced at Coleman. I also informed him I would be filing an official medical report detailing their condition and all interactions with U.S. personnel. Coleman understood the implicit message. She was creating a record that might help his case. "Thank you, ma'am." "Don't thank me yet," Garner said grimly. "Markham still plans to file insubordination charges, and these women are still going to an intelligence processing center tomorrow." They reached the ambulance. Garner began gathering bandages, antiseptic, and other supplies. "What will happen to them there?" Coleman asked. Garner's hands paused. "Best case, basic questioning, then transfer to a civilian camp." She lowered her voice. "Worst case, they're treated as enemy nationals with potential intelligence value. Some interrogators." She didn't finish the thought. Coleman felt a cold knot in his stomach. They'd refused Markham's degrading order, but tomorrow the women would face something potentially worse. Garner handed him a box of supplies. "Let's focus on what we can control right now. These women need shelter, food, and medical care, and they need to understand that not all soldiers are the same." As they walked back to the hut, Coleman saw his squad had already made progress. Bamboo poles formed the skeleton of a simple lean-to adjacent to the hut. Washington and Jones were lashing crossbeams with vines. Inside the hut, Richard sat near the entrance, speaking softly in Japanese. The women remained clustered together, but their postures had relaxed slightly. One was sipping water from a canteen. Another had allowed a medic to bandage her leg. Amy, the older woman with the bandaged arm, watched Coleman enter with Garner. Her eyes held confusion rather than fear now. She said something to Richards. "She wants to know why you really refused the lieutenant's order," Richards translated. "She doesn't believe it was to protect them." Coleman set down the medical supplies. How could he explain? These women had no reason to trust any soldier. "Tell her," Coleman paused. "Tell her it wasn't right. What they've been through, it wasn't right to make them watch something that might frighten them more." Richards translated. Emmy listened, her eyes never leaving Coleman's face. When Richards finished, she spoke again, her voice soft but direct. "She says they've seen many soldiers," Richards translated awkwardly. "Japanese, Filipino resistance, now American. All wanted the same thing eventually." Coleman felt a deep sadness. "Tell her we're not all the same. Tell her we'll help them get somewhere safe." As Richards spoke, Emmy's expression remained skeptical. But the youngest woman, sitting on a bamboo mat with a wet cloth on her forehead, looked up with the first faint glimmer of hope. By early afternoon, the temporary shelter was complete. The bamboo frame supported a roof of broad leaves lashed together with vine, creating a shaded area next to the hut where the women could sit without feeling exposed. Miller had found wild plantains, and Jones had contributed his emergency ration chocolate. The small offering sat on a flat piece of bark, untouched so far. Lieutenant Garner had finished treating the women's immediate medical needs. The youngest, named Hatsuko, had a fever from an infected cut on her leg, but antibiotics were already bringing it down. Another, Yuki, suffered from severe dehydration. The other three, Emi, Saki, and Natsumi, were in better physical condition, though all showed signs of malnutrition and past injuries. Coleman supervised as Washington and Taylor set up a simple perimeter of knotted vines with tin cans attached. A makeshift alarm system. "Not that they're going anywhere," Washington said quietly, tying a knot. "Where would they even go?" Coleman nodded grimly. This part of Luzon was still contested territory. Japanese stragglers, Filipino guerrillas, and American forces all moved through these jungles. For 5 unarmed Japanese women, there was no safe direction. Across the clearing, Markham conferred with the MP sergeant. Their glances toward Coleman's squad made it clear who they were discussing. The younger MP stood at attention nearby, looking bored and uncomfortable in the humid heat. Lieutenant Garner emerged from the hut and approached Coleman. "They're resting now. Hatsuko's fever is coming down." "Good news, ma'am." Garner nodded toward Markham and the MPs. Any update on your situation? Transport arrives tomorrow morning. Charges will be formally filed then. Garner's expression tightened. I've radioed a full report to my commanding officer. He'll ensure it reaches the right channels. Thank you, ma'am, but... Coleman hesitated. It won't change the fact that we disobeyed a direct order. An order that violated basic decency, Garner countered. Coleman shrugged slightly. They both knew the Army didn't always operate on such principles, especially when it came to colored troops. A soft voice spoke from the shelter entrance. Excuse. They turned to see Emmy standing there, her thin frame silhouetted against the dim interior. She held one of the chocolate bars Jones had provided, unwrapped but uneaten. Safe? She asked in halting English, pointing to the chocolate. Yes, Garner said gently. Safe to eat. Emmy nodded, then broke the chocolate into 5 precise pieces. She returned to the shelter where the other women waited. Through the open side, Coleman could see her distribute the pieces, keeping the smallest for herself. She's their leader, Garner said quietly, protecting them as best she can. Coleman watched as the women carefully ate the chocolate, their first taste of sweetness in who knew how long. Even this small pleasure they approached with caution, as if expecting it to be taken away. They don't trust the food, Coleman observed. They don't trust anything, Garner replied. But they're starting to realize you're different. Different. The word hung in the air between them. In the Army, different usually meant problem. The 93rd was different from white units. The 332nd Medical Battalion was different. Being different meant extra scrutiny, fewer resources, and constant doubt from command. But here, being different meant refusing an order that would have further traumatized already suffering women. It meant seeing them as human beings rather than objects or enemies. Richards, Coleman called softly. Come translate for a moment. Richards approached from where he'd been helping set up the perimeter. What do you need, Sarge? Ask Emmy if they need anything else right now. More water, blankets, anything we can provide. Richards nodded and moved toward the shelter. He spoke quietly in Japanese, gesturing occasionally toward the squad and supplies. Emmy responded hesitantly. The conversation went back and forth for several minutes, longer than a simple request would take. Finally, Richards returned. She says they need nothing else. But, he paused. She asked why black soldiers are here in the Philippines. She noticed we're all Negro, except Lieutenant Markham. Coleman and Garner exchanged glances. What did you tell her? Coleman asked. I tried to explain about segregated units. Not sure how much got across. Richard shrugged. She seemed surprised, said Japanese Army doesn't do that. Garner gave a short, humorless laugh. 1 point for the enemy. Coleman studied the shelter where Emmy had retreated to sit with the others. Did she say anything else? Richards hesitated. She asked if that's why we disobeyed, because we're used to being treated badly ourselves. The question hung in the air. Coleman had no easy answer. Yes, they lived with daily humiliations in the segregated army. Yes, they understood what it meant to be viewed as less than human. But that wasn't the whole truth of why they'd refused Markham's order. Next time, Coleman said finally, tell her we did it because it was right. Not because of who we are, but because of who they are. Human beings who deserve dignity. Richards nodded, though his expression suggested he wasn't sure how well that would translate. The remainder of the afternoon passed in uneasy calm. The women mostly stayed in the shelter, venturing out only when necessary. Coleman's squad maintained a respectful distance while continuing to improve the camp, gathering water, reinforcing the shelter, establishing a proper watch rotation. Markham remained with the MPs, occasionally issuing terse orders, but otherwise keeping his distance from both the squad and the medical team. As dusk approached, Garner organized the distribution of field rations for everyone. The women accepted the unfamiliar food cautiously. Hatsuko, her fever reduced, managed a few small bites of canned beans. Yuki, still weak from dehydration, needed help holding her cup of reconstituted powdered milk. Coleman supervised the evening security check, making sure his men knew their watch assignments despite their uncertain status. The MPs would guard them, but someone still needed to guard the perimeter. As the first stars appeared through gaps in the jungle canopy, a radio operator from the medical convoy approached Markham. After a brief exchange, Markham stalked across the clearing toward Garner, who was checking Emmy's bandaged arm. "Lieutenant," he said sharply, "I've received new orders. The women are to be transported to the collection point at dawn tomorrow." Garner straightened, her professional mask slipping for just an instant. "They're not stable enough for transport yet, sir. Hatsuko's infection." "Dawn, Lieutenant," Markham cut her off. "Direct from command. These civilians have potential intelligence value that can't wait for your complete medical regimen." Coleman, standing nearby, felt a chill despite the evening's warmth. The women couldn't understand Markham's words, but they sensed the tension. Their faces grew watchful, alert to danger. "Sir," Coleman spoke up, "moving then before sunrise means traveling in darkness. The trail isn't secure." Markham turned cold eyes to Coleman. "I don't recall asking for your tactical assessment, Sergeant, especially given your current status." "Lieutenant," Garner tried again, "as medical officer, I strongly advise against moving these patients before they've had at least 24 hours of stabilization." "Noted, Lieutenant. Your advice has been considered and overruled." Markham's tone left no room for argument. "Prepare them for transport at 0500 hours." As Markham walked away, Emmy looked questioningly at Garner. She'd understood none of the words, but everything in the officer's postures and tones conveyed bad news. "Richards," Coleman called softly, "we need you." Richards hurried over. Garner sighed heavily, then nodded for him to translate. "Tell them there's been a change of plans," she said. "They're being moved tomorrow at dawn, to a place where other civilians are gathered." As Richards spoke, the women's expressions shifted from wariness to fear. Emmy asked a sharp question. "She wants to know what kind of place," Richards translated, "if it's like where they were before." Garner shook her head firmly. "No, it's a processing center for civilians. They'll be given food, shelter, and continued medical care." She hesitated. "Tell them I'll accompany them. I won't leave them alone." When Richards translated this, Emmy's eyes widened slightly. She studied Garner's face, then looked at Coleman, standing nearby. Slowly, deliberately, she bowed her head slightly, not a full bow, but an acknowledgement. "Arigato," she said softly. "She says thank you," Richards explained unnecessarily. Coleman nodded in response, a gesture that crossed all language barriers. He understood what Emmy was really saying. She recognized their efforts, even if she wasn't sure she could trust them. As darkness fell completely, the jungle came alive with night sounds. Insects buzzing, distant birds calling, the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Coleman arranged his squad in shifts, 2 men always awake despite the MP's presence. Garner had convinced Markham to allow a small fire for heating water and providing some light for the medical team. Around this muted glow, the camp settled into an uneasy rest. The women huddled in their shelter. The medical team dozed in and around the ambulances. Markham and the MPs maintained their separate position near the field radio. Coleman took first watch with Jones. They sat at the perimeter, backs against a massive tree trunk, rifles across their knees. "What do you think'll happen to us, Sarge?" Jones asked quietly. Coleman stared into the darkness. "Court-martial, probably. Reduction in rank at minimum. Possibly worse." Jones nodded slowly. "Worth it, though. What he wanted to do to those women." "We did what was right," Coleman agreed. "But the Army doesn't always reward right." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the jungle's nighttime chorus. "My daddy fought in the Great War," Jones said finally. "Came back with medals they wouldn't let him wear in public. Said fighting for freedom overseas just made coming home to Jim Crow even harder." He adjusted his injured shoulder. "I understand what he meant now." Coleman nodded. Every black soldier understood that contradiction, fighting for a freedom abroad that they didn't fully enjoy at home. "When I enlisted," Coleman said, "my mother cried, not because she was afraid I'd die, but because she was afraid of what the army would do to my spirit." He paused. "She said, 'Don't let them make you forget who you are.'" Wise woman. She was right to worry. Some days it's hard to remember. Coleman looked toward the dimly visible shelter where the Japanese women slept. "But today I remembered. From the darkness beyond the perimeter came a sound, the snap of a branch too heavy to be an animal." Coleman and Jones instantly raised their rifles, bodies tense. "Password," Coleman called softly. "Bluebird," came the response. Correct, but the voice was unfamiliar. A moment later, a figure emerged from the shadows. Another MP. This one a staff sergeant with a hard face and an official-looking dispatch case. "Message for Lieutenant Markham," the newcomer announced. "Urgent." As he moved toward Markham's position, Coleman and Jones exchanged glances. Whatever was in that dispatch case would determine what happened at dawn, to the women and to them. The MP staff sergeant ducked into Markham's tent. Coleman and Jones remained alert at their post, straining to hear the muffled conversation. After a few minutes, raised voices carried across the clearing. "I don't care what the medical opinion is," Markham's voice cut through the night. "Those are my orders." Coleman exchanged a glance with Jones. Whatever was in that dispatch had only strengthened Markham's resolve. The tent flap opened. Markham emerged with the MP sergeant. Both men's faces tight with anger in the dim glow of their lantern. They strode across the clearing, toward the medical area where Garner was checking on her patients. "Lieutenant Garner," Markham called sharply. Garner straightened, fatigue evident in her posture as she stepped away from the shelter. "Yes, sir?" "New orders." Markham thrust a paper toward her. "The women are to be moved immediately. Intelligence believes they may have time-sensitive information about Japanese positions." Garner took the paper, reading it quickly in the faint light. "Sir, moving patients in their condition, in darkness?" "Those are direct orders, Lieutenant." Markham cut her off. "Prepare them for transport within 30 minutes. Coleman felt his stomach knot. The jungle was dangerous enough in daylight. At night, with the trail barely visible and possible Japanese stragglers in the area, moving 5 traumatized women would be both dangerous and cruel. "Sir," he called out before he could stop himself. "Permission to speak." Markham turned slowly. "Denied, Sergeant. You've said quite enough for one day." But Garner seized the opening. "Lieutenant Markham, as the medical officer responsible for these civilians, I must insist we wait until morning. The risk of injury during night movement is unacceptable." "Your objection is noted," Markham said coldly, "but these orders come directly from Colonel Harding at Intelligence Section. The women move tonight." The name sent a chill through Coleman. Colonel Harding was known throughout the division, a man with a reputation for brutal efficiency and little concern for those he considered beneath him or against him. If Harding wanted the women immediately, no medical objection would stop it. Garner's shoulders stiffened. "Then I request to accompany them to their destination, for medical continuity." Markham hesitated, clearly unhappy with the request, but unable to find a valid reason to refuse it. "Fine, you and 1 medic. The rest of your team continues to their original assignment." He turned to the MP sergeant. "Prepare a transport. Full security protocol." As the men walked away, Garner approached Coleman and Jones at their post. Her face was grim in the faint moonlight filtering through the jungle canopy. "It's worse than I thought," she said quietly. "Colonel Harding's intelligence unit has a reputation. They don't just gather information." Coleman nodded. They'd all heard stories, interrogations that crossed lines, detainees who disappeared. "What can we do?" he asked. Garner looked toward the shelter where the women slept, unaware of what was coming. "I'll go with them. Document everything. It's not much, but it's something," Coleman finished for her. "Better than nothing." The shelter rustled as Emmy emerged, sensing the increased activity in the camp. She looked questioningly at Garner, then at Coleman. "Richards," Coleman called softly. "We need you." Richards appeared from where he'd been sleeping nearby, rubbing his eyes. "What's happening, Sarge?" "They're moving the women tonight. Now. Need you to translate." Richards's face fell as he understood the implications. He moved to Emmy's side and spoke gently in Japanese. Her expression changed from confusion to fear as she listened. She asked several rapid questions, her voice rising slightly. "She wants to know why they can't wait until morning," Richards translated. "Where they're being taken, if they'll be separated." Garner stepped forward. "Tell her they're being taken to an intelligence center where they'll be asked questions about Japanese forces in the area. Tell her I'll stay with them. They won't be separated." As Richards translated, activity increased around the clearing. The MP sergeant directed 2 soldiers to prepare a truck. Markham issued orders to secure the perimeter during the transfer. The rest of Coleman's squad, awakened by the commotion, stood uncertainly near their sleeping area, watching. Emmy listened to Richards, then disappeared back into the shelter. Hushed, frightened voices rose from inside as she told the others. "I don't like this, Sarge," Jones murmured. "None of us do," Coleman replied. "But there's nothing we can do to stop it." Garner gave him a long look. "You already did more than most would have. Remember that." She turned and walked toward the ambulance to gather medical supplies for the journey. Coleman watched her go, feeling helpless. His stand against Markham had given the women a few hours of relative peace, but in the end, it hadn't changed their fate. The camp bustled with preparations. Medics gathered supplies while MPs checked the perimeter. Markham stood by the radio, sending updates to headquarters. Coleman remained at his post, knowing he was powerless to stop what was happening, but unwilling to turn away. The women emerged from their shelter, huddled together like frightened birds. Emmy at the center. "Hatsuko, tell Emmy we have to go, but Lieutenant Garner will stay with them," Coleman said quietly. Tell her to stay strong." Richards nodded and spoke softly in Japanese. Emmy listened, her face a mask of resignation. Then, to Coleman's surprise, she stepped forward and bowed deeply, formally. The other women, watching her, did the same. "She says thank you for your honor," Richards translated. "For seeing them as people." Coleman's throat tightened. He returned the bow, not knowing what else to do. When he straightened, Emmy's eyes met his directly for the first time. In them he saw fear, but also a dignity that all she had suffered couldn't erase. "Tell her we won't forget them," Coleman said. As Richards translated, Garner approached with her medical bag. "It's time," she said softly. Coleman nodded, then turned to his waiting squad. "Move out. Secure the trail to the main road." As they disappeared into the jungle darkness, the sound of the truck's engine rumbling to life followed them. Coleman didn't look back. He couldn't bear to see the women loaded like cargo, headed to an uncertain fate. The squad moved silently through the undergrowth, using their training to navigate without lights. No one spoke. Each man carried not just his weapon, but the weight of everything they'd witnessed and had been powerless to change. 20 minutes later, they returned to find the clearing eerily quiet. The truck was gone. So was Garner, her chosen medic, and the women. Markham stood by the radio, face illuminated by a small lamp as he logged the night's events. "Report, Sergeant," he said without looking up. "Trail secure to the main road, sir. No signs of enemy activity." Markham nodded. "Good. Your squad will remain here until transport arrives tomorrow morning. The MPs will ensure you stay put." The dismissal was clear. Coleman saluted, though Markham didn't bother to look up to see it, and rejoined his men. They settled back into their watch positions, the night suddenly longer and emptier than before. "They're really gone," Washington said softly. "Just like that." Coleman nodded, staring into the darkness toward the trail where the truck had disappeared. Just like that. The remainder of the night passed in tense silence. Coleman's squad maintained their watch rotation despite their uncertain status. The MPs kept their distance, but remained vigilant, weapons ready, as if expecting the black soldiers to make a break for it. Markham had retreated to his tent after logging the women's transfer. Occasionally, his shadow moved against the canvas as he paced or consulted papers. Around 3 in the morning, Coleman sat on a fallen log at the edge of the clearing, taking his turn at watch. The jungle breathed around him, insects buzzing, nocturnal creatures rustling through the underbrush, leaves whispering in the slight breeze. "Mind if I join you?" Richards appeared from the shadows, rifle slung across his back. "You should be sleeping," Coleman said, but moved over to make space on the log. Richards sat heavily. Dark circles beneath his eyes showed the toll of the past 24 hours. "Can't sleep. Keep thinking about those women." Coleman nodded. They all did. "You know," Richards continued, "when I was translating for them, the things they told me about what happened at that camp." He shook his head. "Makes you wonder how people can do that to each other." "War brings out the worst in some folks," Coleman said, quietly, "and the best in others." Richards looked at him. "You think we did the right thing, standing up to Markham like that?" "I know we did." Coleman's voice held no doubt. "Don't matter what happens to us now. We didn't add to their suffering. That's something." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the jungle night. "My grandmother was full Japanese," Richard said suddenly. "That's how I know the language. She came to California as a picture bride in 1904, married my grandfather sight unseen." Coleman glanced at him, surprised. Richards had never mentioned this before. "After Pearl Harbor, they took her away," Richards continued. "Sent her to Manzanar with all the other Japanese. Didn't matter that she'd been in America 40 years. Didn't matter that her son, my father, was fighting in Europe with the 442nd. His voice hardened. "Didn't matter that my grandfather died waiting for her to come home." "I'm sorry," Coleman said softly. Richard shrugged, a gesture that failed to hide his pain. "When I saw those women in the hut, for a second I thought about my grandmother. Wondered if anyone showed her kindness when they took her away." Coleman had no answer for that. They both knew the likely truth. "That's why I enlisted," Richard said. "Thought if I served, wore the uniform, people would see Japanese Americans differently, see all of us differently." He gave a bitter laugh. "Now look at us, about to be court-martialed for basic human decency." "It still matters," Coleman insisted. "What we did. The women saw it, Lieutenant Garner saw it. Even if nobody else ever knows, it matters." Richards nodded slowly. "Yeah, I guess it does." The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when they heard it, the distant rumble of engines approaching. Coleman stood. "That's not our transport. Too early." He moved quickly to wake the rest of the squad. By the time the vehicles reached the clearing's edge, all 5 men stood ready, uncertain what new development was coming. 3 jeeps pulled into the clearing. The lead vehicle carried a stern-faced colonel with intelligence insignia. Behind him came 2 jeeps filled with MPs, far more than needed to transport Coleman's squad. Markham emerged from his tent, hastily tucking in his uniform shirt. He snapped to attention as the colonel stepped down from the jeep. "Colonel Harding, sir," Markham saluted. "Wasn't expecting you personally." Harding, a tall man with cold eyes and a thin mouth, returned the salute curtly. "Situations develop, Lieutenant. Need to debrief you and deal with these troublemakers directly." His gaze swept over Coleman's squad, assessing them with the detached interest of a man viewing defective equipment rather than soldiers. "These are the ones who refused orders?" Harding asked. "Yes, sir," Markham replied. "Sergeant Coleman and 5 privates." Harding approached, stopping a few paces from Coleman. "Sergeant, I understand you countermanded Lieutenant Markham's direct order yesterday. That correct?" Coleman stood at attention. "I refused an order I believed to be inappropriate, sir. I did not countermand it." "Semantics," Harding waved his hand dismissively. "The women you found, they're now in my facility. Lieutenant Garner has been quite vocal about their treatment." Coleman kept his expression neutral, though the mention of Garner sent a surge of hope through him. She was still fighting for the women. "Those civilians may have critical intelligence about Japanese unit movements," Harding continued. "Your interference delayed their proper processing." "With respect, sir," Coleman said carefully, "they were former comfort women. Victims, not combatants." Harding's eyes narrowed. "You're not qualified to make that determination, Sergeant. That's for intelligence to decide." He turned to Markham. I'm taking these men into custody myself. The division commander wants this handled quickly and quietly. Yes, sir, Markham nodded. And Lieutenant, Harding added, I'll need you to come as well. Complete the paperwork, provide your statement. Markham straightened. Of course, sir. Harding turned back to Coleman. You and your men will be transported to the intelligence compound for processing. Given the circumstances, I'm authorizing restraints. Coleman felt his squad stiffen behind him. Restraints. Like criminals, like prisoners. Is that necessary, sir? He asked, keeping his voice level. We've complied with all orders since the incident. It's standard procedure, Sergeant, Harding said coldly, unless you'd like to add another refusal to your record. Coleman met the colonel's gaze. No, sir. Good. MPs, secure the prisoners. The MPs moved forward with handcuffs. Coleman submitted silently, feeling the cold metal close around his wrists. Behind him, his squad did the same, dignity intact despite the humiliation. As they were led toward the waiting jeeps, Coleman caught Richards's eye. A silent message passed between them. Stay strong. Remember why we did this. The journey to the intelligence compound took nearly 2 hours, winding through jungle trails and finally connecting to a wider dirt road. Coleman and Washington were in the middle jeep, squeezed between armed NPs who stared straight ahead, avoiding eye contact. The compound appeared suddenly as they crested a hill, a collection of wood and canvas structures surrounded by barbed wire. Watchtowers stood at each corner, manned by soldiers with mounted machine guns. It looked less like a military intelligence facility and more like a prison camp. As they passed through the gate, Coleman scanned the compound, looking for any sign of the women or Lieutenant Garner. There was none. The jeep stopped in front of the main building, a long wooden structure with a metal roof. Harding stepped down from the lead vehicle and conferred briefly with an officer who came out to meet him. They both looked toward the jeeps containing Coleman and his squad. Bring them inside, Harding ordered. Separate rooms. Coleman was led through the building's front door and down a narrow hallway lined with small offices. The MP guided him into one of these, a plain room with a metal table, 2 chairs, and a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The window was covered with heavy canvas. Wait here, the MP said, removing Coleman's handcuffs. Don't try anything. The door closed with a heavy thud. Coleman heard the click of a lock, then footsteps retreating down the hall. He rubbed his wrists where the cuffs had dug into his skin, then took a seat at the table, back straight, hands folded in front of him. Time passed slowly. Coleman had no watch, but he estimated at least an hour went by before the door opened again. To his surprise, it wasn't Harding or an interrogator who entered, but Lieutenant Garner. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, her uniform rumpled from what had clearly been a sleepless night. But her spine was straight, her gaze direct. Lieutenant, Coleman started to rise. Stay seated, Sergeant, she said, closing the door behind her. I don't have much time. She took the chair opposite him. They don't know I'm here. I'm supposed to be completing medical reports on the women. How are they? Coleman asked immediately. Physically stable. Emotionally, she shook her head. Harding's interrogators have been questioning them for hours. They're terrified. Coleman's jaw tightened. Have they been mistreated? Not physically, as far as I can tell, but the questioning is intense. Garner leaned forward. That's not why I'm here. I need to know exactly what happened with Markham's order. Everything. I'm filing a formal protest. Coleman blinked in surprise. A protest won't stop a court-martial, ma'am. Maybe not, Garner agreed, but I have a friend at division headquarters, a doctor who outranks Harding. If I can get a full report to him, there's a chance. Hope flickered in Coleman's chest, but he tamped it down. False hope was worse than none. Why would you risk that for us, ma'am? You barely know us. Garner's eyes flashed. Because what I've seen in the last 24 hours makes me sick, Sergeant. Markham humiliating black soldiers, Harding treating traumatized women like enemy combatants. And the only people who stood up against it are now in custody. She took a deep breath. If I don't speak up, I'm part of the problem. Coleman studied her face, the determination in her eyes, the set of her jaw. She meant every word. Tell me everything, she said. Start from the beginning. Coleman did. He described finding the women, their condition, Markham's order, and the squad's refusal. He explained their reasoning, the women's trauma, the unnecessary humiliation, the basic human dignity at stake. Garner took notes in a small pad, her handwriting tight and precise. When Coleman finished, she reviewed what she'd written. This matches what I observed, she said, and what the women told me once they began to trust me a little. Will it make a difference? Coleman asked. Garner met his gaze directly. I don't know, but doing nothing definitely won't. Footsteps sounded in the hallway. Garner quickly tucked her notepad into her pocket. I need to go, she whispered. They're watching me, but I'll try to check on your men. Thank you, Lieutenant. She stood, smoothing her uniform. Don't thank me yet, Sergeant. We're all still in this mess. The door opened before she reached it. Colonel Harding stood in the doorway, his cold eyes moving between Garner and Coleman. Lieutenant, his voice was dangerously soft. I don't recall authorizing you to speak with the prisoners. Garner straightened. I was checking Sergeant Coleman's physical condition, sir. Standard medical protocol for detainees. Harding's expression made it clear he didn't believe her. Your concern for these men is admirable, Lieutenant, but perhaps misplaced. He stepped aside, gesturing to the hallway. You have patients waiting. I suggest you attend to them. Garner hesitated, then walked past Harding without another word. Coleman watched her go, hoping his face didn't betray the concern he felt for her now. Harding entered the room, closing the door behind him. He didn't sit, choosing instead to stand over Coleman, using his height for intimidation. That was unwise, Sergeant, he said. Lieutenant Garner is already on thin ice. Fraternizing with prisoners won't help her case. Coleman remained silent. Nothing he could say would improve the situation. Harding paced slowly around the table. Your actions have created quite a problem for this command, Coleman. Insubordination during a combat operation, undermining officer authority, potentially compromising intelligence gathering. He stopped, leaning forward with his hands on the table. The standard penalty is severe, you understand that? Yes, sir, Coleman replied evenly. However, Harding straightened. The division commander is concerned about morale implications. The 93rd has been performing adequately in combat. Losing an experienced sergeant and 5 trained men to court-martial wouldn't serve operational needs. Coleman kept his face neutral, though confusion stirred within him. This didn't sound like the punishment he'd expected. So I've been authorized to offer an alternative, Harding continued. A statement from you and your men acknowledging the error of your actions. A formal apology to Lieutenant Markham. Acceptance of reduction in rank and pay grade. He paused. No court-martial, no dishonorable discharge. The offer hung in the air between them. Coleman thought carefully before responding. And if we refuse, sir? Harding's mouth tightened. Then the full weight of military justice falls on you, Sergeant. Court-martial. Likely prison time at Fort Leavenworth. Dishonorable discharge that will follow you the rest of your life. Coleman knew he should feel relieved at the offered compromise. It was better than he'd expected, than any of them had expected. But something about it felt wrong. May I ask a question, sir? Harding raised an eyebrow. Go ahead. What happens to the women, the civilians? That's not your concern anymore, Sergeant. With respect, sir, it is my concern, Coleman said quietly. We found them. We're responsible for how they're treated. Harding's face hardened. You're in no position to make demands or conditions, Coleman. The civilians will be processed according to standard intelligence protocols, then transferred to a civilian internment facility. That's all you need to know. Coleman knew standard intelligence protocols could mean anything. He thought of Emmy's dignity, of Hatsuko's fever, of the fear in all their eyes. He thought of Lieutenant Garner fighting for them alone. "I need to consult with my men, sir," he said finally, "before I can answer." Harding studied him for a long moment. "You have 1 hour, Sergeant. Then I want your decision." He moved to the door. "I should warn you, refusing my generous offer would be extremely unwise." After Harding left, Coleman was led to a larger room where his squad waited. Their faces brightened when they saw him, relief evident in their postures. "Sarge, you okay?" Washington asked. "I'm fine," Coleman assured them. "How about all of you?" They nodded, though weariness showed in their eyes. They'd been up all night, had traveled in handcuffs, and now faced possible court-martial. Yet their dignity remained intact. Coleman quickly explained Harding's offer. Reduction in rank, formal apology, no court-martial. "What's the catch?" Jones asked suspiciously. "We admit we were wrong," Coleman said. "Say Markham's order was legitimate." The men exchanged glances. "But it wasn't legitimate," Washington protested. "It was wrong. We all know it." Miller shook his head. "My daddy didn't raise me to apologize for doing right." "What about the women?" Richards asked quietly. "Do we know what happens to them?" Coleman sighed. "Harding says they'll be processed, then sent to an internment facility, whatever that means." "It means they're treated like prisoners instead of victims," Taylor said bitterly. Coleman looked at each man in turn. "I won't make this decision for us. We're in this together, but I want you all to understand what's at stake. Court-martial means prison, dishonorable discharge, no benefits, no GI Bill, hard to find work back home." A heavy silence fell over the room. Each man laid the consequences against his conscience. "I saw Lieutenant Garner," Coleman added. "She's filing a protest, trying to get help from division headquarters. But I can't promise it'll make any difference." Washington, the youngest, spoke up first. "My mama taught me that a man who stands for nothing will fall for anything." He straightened his shoulders. "I'm not saying I was wrong when I wasn't." Jones nodded. "I'm with Washington. Can't go home and tell my wife I bowed my head and lied just to save my stripes." One by one, the others voiced similar sentiments. Richards was the last to speak. "Those women have had everything taken from them," he said quietly. "Their homes, their dignity, their choices. All they have left is the truth of what happened to them. If we say what we did was wrong, we're taking that too." Coleman felt a surge of pride in his men, and fear for them. "You all understand what you're risking?" 5 heads nodded. "Then I'm with you," Coleman said. "We tell the truth. We did what was right." When Harding returned, his face showed no surprise at their decision. Perhaps he'd expected it. Perhaps he'd even counted on it. "Very well, Sergeant," he said coldly. "You and your men will be held here pending formal charges. I expect the court-martial to convene within the week." Coleman nodded, accepting the consequence with the same dignity that had led him to refuse Markham's order in the first place. "One more thing, sir," he said, as Harding turned to leave. "What is it, Coleman?" "I'd like to make a formal request that Lieutenant Garner not face any repercussions for advocating for proper medical treatment for the civilians." Harding's eyes narrowed. "You're hardly in a position to make requests, Sergeant." "No, sir, but I'm making it anyway." For a moment, something like reluctant respect flickered in Harding's eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by cold dismissal. "MPs will escort you to your holding area," he said, ignoring Coleman's request entirely. "You'll remain there until transport to division headquarters arrives." As the door closed behind him, Coleman turned to his men. "Whatever happens next, I'm proud to serve with each of you." The squad nodded, a solemn acknowledgement of what they'd committed to, and what it might cost them. The holding area turned out to be a barracks-like room with cots and a single barred window. 2 armed MPs stood guard outside the door. The squad was given basic rations and water, but otherwise left alone through the afternoon. They passed the time quietly, each man absorbed in his thoughts. Washington napped fitfully. Jones wrote a letter to his wife, though he had no way to send it. Richards sat by the window, watching activity in the compound. "Something's happening," he said suddenly, late in the afternoon. "More vehicles arriving." The others moved to the window, craning for a view. 3 jeeps had pulled into the compound. From the center vehicle stepped an officer with medical corps insignia, a full colonel by his eagles. "That must be Garner's friend from headquarters," Coleman said, hope rising in his chest. They watched as the medical colonel was greeted by Harding, the 2 officers exchanging salutes that looked stiff even from a distance. Words were exchanged, Harding gesturing emphatically while the medical colonel listened with a stone face. "Wish we could hear what they're saying," Taylor muttered. "Don't need to hear," Miller said. "Look at Harding's face. He's not happy." It was true. Even from a distance, Harding's displeasure was evident in his rigid posture and sharp gestures. The medical colonel remained calm, occasionally consulting a sheaf of papers he carried. Papers that looked suspiciously like the notes Garner had taken during her conversation with Coleman. After several minutes of what appeared to be increasingly heated discussion, both colonels entered the main building and disappeared from view. "What do you think it means, Sarge?" Washington asked. Coleman shook his head. "Don't know, but someone with equal rank to Harding is here, asking questions. That's better than nothing." An hour passed, with no further developments. The squad ate their evening rations in silence, listening to the muffled sounds of the compound winding down for the night. Occasional shouts carried from the barbed wire perimeter, where guards patrolled with flashlights. Just as dusk deepened into night, the door to their holding area opened. Lieutenant Garner entered, followed by an MP who remained by the door, watching closely. The squad jumped to their feet. Garner looked different, still tired, but with a new energy in her movements, a determined set to her jaw. "At ease," she said. "I don't have much time." Coleman gestured for her to take the lone chair in the room. She sat, the squad gathering around her. "Colonel Reynolds is here," she said without preamble. "Chief Medical Officer for the division. He's reviewed my report and interviewed the women personally." "What did they tell him?" Richards asked. "Everything," Garner's eyes flashed. "Once they understood he was there to help, they confirmed what happened with Markham's order. They also described how you treated them with respect afterward." She looked at Coleman. "Emmy told him about your refusal, how it confused them at first, then made them realize not all soldiers were the same." Coleman felt a weight lift slightly from his chest. "And Harding, what's he saying?" Garner's expression hardened. "He's fighting back. Claims the women are confused, traumatized, unreliable witnesses. Says you endangered a combat operation by refusing a legitimate order." "So nothing's changed," Jones said bitterly. "That's not true," Garner countered. "Colonel Reynolds outranks Harding, and he's furious about how the women have been treated. He's ordered immediate medical evacuation for all 5 to the base hospital." The squad exchanged hopeful glances. "What about us?" Washington asked. Garner's expression sobered. "That's more complicated. Reynolds has requested a full review of the incident before any court-martial proceeds. But Markham's standing by his story, and Harding's backing him." Coleman nodded. It was about what he'd expected. "At least the women will be okay." "There's more," Garner said, leaning forward. "Reynolds wants to talk to you directly, Sergeant, tonight." Coleman blinked in surprise. "Me? Why?" "He wants your account without Harding's filtering." Garner glanced at the MP by the door, lowering her voice. "Reynolds doesn't trust Harding. There have been other incidents with how he handles civilians." The implication hung in the air. Harding's harsh methods had raised concerns before. "When?" Coleman asked. "Soon. They're finishing with the women's transfer now." Garner stood. "I need to go help with that. But I wanted you to know, you're not alone in this fight anymore." As she moved toward the door, she paused. "Oh, and Sergeant? Emmy asked about you. All of you. Wanted to know if you were okay." A smile tugged at Coleman's lips, despite everything. "Tell her we're fine. Tell her to take care of herself and the others now." Garner nodded. "I will." After she left, a new energy filled the holding area. The men moved around, straightening their rumpled uniforms as best they could, talking in low, animated voices. "You think this colonel can really help us, Sarge?" Miller asked. "Don't know," Coleman answered honestly. but having someone listen to our side is more than I expected. About an hour later, the door opened again. 2 MPs entered. "Sergeant Coleman," one said. "Colonel Reynolds wants to see you." Coleman nodded to his men, a silent reassurance, then followed the MPs out into the night air. The compound was mostly dark now, with only a few lights burning in the main building. The MPs led him there, through the same hallway as before, but to a different room, larger, with a proper desk and chairs. Colonel Reynolds sat behind the desk, reading through papers by lamplight. He was older than Harding, with silver at his temples and deep lines around his eyes that spoke of years of service. "Sergeant Coleman," he said, looking up. "Have a seat." Coleman sat at attention, waiting for the colonel to speak first. Reynolds studied him for a long moment. "I've heard several versions of what happened yesterday," he said finally. "Lieutenant Markham's, Colonel Harding's, Lieutenant Garner's, and most recently, the civilians." He set down his papers. "Now I want to hear yours, from the beginning." Coleman took a deep breath, then told his story exactly as it had happened. Finding the women, Markham's order, the refusal, the aftermath. He didn't embellish or make excuses. He simply stated the facts as he'd experienced them. Reynolds listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes. When Coleman finished, the colonel sat back in his chair. "Why did you refuse the order, Sergeant?" "In your own words." Coleman met his gaze directly. "Because it was wrong, sir. Those women had been through hell. Stripping down in front of them would only terrify them more, make them think we were no better than those who'd abused them. You understand the seriousness of refusing an order?" "Yes, sir, I do." Reynolds nodded slowly. "Did racial factors play a role in your decision? The fact that Lieutenant Markham is white and your squad is Negro?" Coleman considered the question carefully. "I can't say for certain what was in Lieutenant Markham's mind, sir. But I know many white officers see colored troops differently, expect less, demand more, and sometimes they give orders they wouldn't give to white soldiers." "That's a serious allegation, Sergeant." "Yes, sir, but it's the truth as I've lived it." Reynolds studied him for a long moment, then looked down at his notes. "The Japanese women told us something interesting. They said at first they thought you refused because you were planning something worse. They couldn't understand why soldiers would protect them." He looked up. "Until now, they'd only experienced cruelty from men in uniform, any uniform." Coleman nodded. "Richards, our translator, told us the same thing. One of them, Emmy, was quite insistent that I understand what your refusal meant to them." Reynolds continued. "She said it was the first moment in over a year that she felt human again, that someone saw her as a person worth protecting." He closed his folder. "That's quite a powerful statement, Sergeant." "They're strong women, sir, after everything they've endured." Reynolds stood, moving to the window that looked out over the darkened compound. "I've suspended Colonel Harding pending a full investigation. His methods of questioning the women were inappropriate. Lieutenant Garner documented everything." Coleman tried to keep his face neutral, though relief flooded through him. "What will happen to the women now, sir?" "They'll be treated at the base hospital, then placed in a civilian recovery facility, not an internment camp," Reynolds emphasized. "Lieutenant Garner has volunteered to oversee their care." "And my men, sir?" Coleman asked. Unable to keep the question back any longer, Reynolds turned from the window. "That's more complicated. Refusing an order, even a morally questionable one, has consequences. The Army runs on discipline." Coleman nodded, accepting this reality. "I understand, sir, but I'd do it again." A ghost of a smile touched Reynolds' lips. "I believe you would, Sergeant." He returned to his desk. "I've recommended that formal court-martial proceedings be suspended pending full review. In the meantime, you and your squad will return to your unit without Markham. He's being reassigned." Coleman blinked, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. "We're not being charged, sir?" "I didn't say that, Sergeant. The review will determine final disciplinary action, There may still be consequences. Reynolds' expression softened slightly. But I don't believe men should be punished for showing basic human decency, especially not when they've already faced combat and proven their courage. Thank you, sir, Coleman said, voice thick with emotion. Reynolds nodded dismissively. You'll remain here tonight. Transport arrives tomorrow morning to return you and your squad to your unit. The women will be moved to the hospital tonight, under Lieutenant Garner's supervision. Coleman stood, saluting. Yes, sir. As he turned to leave, Reynolds spoke again. Coleman, sir, what you and your men did, it mattered. Remember that. Yes, sir, we will. The MPs escorted Coleman back to the holding area, where his squad waited anxiously. Their faces lit up when he entered, reading the good news in his expression before he even spoke. We're going back to the unit tomorrow, he announced. No court-martial for now. They're reviewing the case. A wave of relief passed through the room. Washington grinned widely. Jones clapped Miller on the shoulder. And the women? Richards asked. Being transferred to the base hospital tonight. Lieutenant Garner's going with them. They'll be properly cared for. Richards nodded, satisfaction evident in his face. What about Markham and Harding? Taylor wanted to know. Markham's being reassigned. Harding's suspended pending investigation. The men exchanged looks of disbelief and cautious joy. So we won, Sarge? Washington asked. Coleman shook his head. Not one, exactly. There may still be consequences, but we did right, and this time, right was recognized. They settled onto their cots, the tension of the past 2 days finally easing. For the first time since finding the women in that half-collapsed hut, Coleman felt he might actually sleep. Sarge, Washington's voice came softly through the darkness. Yeah? You think we'll see them again, the women? Coleman stared at the ceiling, thinking of Emmy's dignity, her formal bow, the growing trust in her eyes. I don't know, but I hope they find peace, wherever they go. Me too, Washington replied. Me too. Outside their window, the night sky was clear, stars bright against the darkness. Somewhere across the compound, the women were preparing for their journey to safety. Small victories in a world at war, but victories nonetheless. The next morning dawned clear and bright, sunlight streaming through the barred window of the holding area. Coleman woke early, his body accustomed to pre-dawn reveille, despite the exhaustion of the previous days. Around him, his squad still slept, Jones snoring softly, Washington curled like a child on his narrow cot, the others in various states of restless slumber. Coleman sat up quietly, not wanting to disturb them. They deserved whatever rest they could get. He moved to the window, looking out over the intelligence compound as it came to life with the new day. Soldiers walked between buildings, morning cigarettes glowing in the dawn light. A jeep rumbled past, stirring dust that hung golden in the early sun. Somewhere out there, the women were preparing for transport to the base hospital. Coleman hoped they'd slept better than he had. His dreams had been fractured things, Emmy's face morphing into his mother's, warning him about the cost of standing up. Markham's cold eyes, watching as Coleman stood before a military tribunal. The youngest woman, Hatsuko, looking at him with that first flicker of trust. The door opened, startling Coleman from his thoughts. An MP entered, carrying a tray with metal cups and a pot of coffee. Mess hall's sending breakfast in 20 minutes, the MP said, setting down the tray. Colonel Reynolds said you men are to be treated properly. Coleman nodded his thanks. The MP hesitated, then added more quietly, those women left about an hour ago. Lieutenant Garner was with them. Thought you'd want to know. Before Coleman could respond, the MP was gone, door closing behind him. Coleman moved to the coffee, the familiar bitter smell bringing a small comfort. As he poured cups for when his men woke, he felt relief knowing the women were on their way to better care. At least that part had gone right. The squad woke gradually as the smell of coffee filled the small room. They drank in sleepy silence, each man processing the events of the past days in his own way. When breakfast arrived, powdered eggs, toast, and canned fruit, they ate with the focused attention of soldiers who knew to take food whenever it was offered. "What happens now, Sarge?" Washington asked, scraping the last of his eggs from his metal plate. "We wait for transport back to the unit," Coleman replied. "Try to pick up where we left off." "Think they'll split us up?" Jones worried. "Reassign us to different squads?" It was a valid concern. Breaking up the squad could be a quieter punishment than formal charges, and harder to fight. "If they do, we keep doing our jobs," Coleman said firmly. "We stay focused on the war, not on what happened here." The men nodded, though unease hung in the air. They'd become a family of sorts, forged in combat, and now in this shared act of defiance. The thought of separation weighed heavily. Footsteps in the hallway silenced their conversation. The door opened to reveal Colonel Harding, flanked by 2 MPs. His face was rigid with barely controlled anger. "On your feet," he ordered. The squad stood quickly, plates clattering as they set them aside. "Your transport has arrived," Harding announced. "You'll be returned to your unit immediately. Colonel Reynolds has," he paused, jaw working, "temporarily suspended disciplinary proceedings." Coleman kept his expression neutral, though inside he felt a surge of relief. Whatever Colonel Reynolds had done had overridden Harding's desire to see them punished. "However," Harding continued, eyes cold, "this incident will remain in your files, and I assure you, it isn't over." The threat hung in the air. Coleman met Harding's gaze steadily. "We understand, sir." Harding's lips thinned. "I don't think you do, Sergeant. Men who undermine command authority in wartime rarely fare well in the long run." He gestured to the MPs. "Escort them to the transport. No restraints, Colonel's orders." As they filed past Harding, Coleman felt the Colonel's eyes boring into him. This man was now their enemy as surely as any Japanese soldier, and potentially more dangerous. He had rank, power, and a wounded pride that wouldn't heal easily. Outside, the morning sun had risen higher, burning away the lingering mist. A canvas-covered truck waited in the compound yard, engine idling. To Coleman's surprise, Lieutenant Markham stood nearby, his face set in a rigid mask as he watched their approach. "Hold up," Markham called as they neared the truck. "A word, Sergeant Coleman." Coleman signaled his men to continue boarding, then stepped aside to face Markham. The lieutenant's eyes were bloodshot, his uniform impeccable as always, but his face haggard. "You think you've won some kind of victory," Markham said, voice low. "Got the brass to take your side." "No victory, sir," Coleman replied carefully. "Just doing what we believed was right." Markham's laugh held no humor. "Right? You humiliated me in front of my command, undermined my authority with the men. That's what you did." Coleman remained silent. There was nothing he could say that wouldn't make this worse. "I'm being reassigned," Markham continued bitterly. "Headquarters company, pushing papers while the war continues without me. My combat record, tarnished because you couldn't follow a simple order." "The order was wrong, sir," Coleman said quietly. "Those women had suffered enough." Markham's face flushed. "You're not qualified to make that determination, Sergeant. I am the officer. I decide what orders are appropriate." "Yes, sir." Coleman kept his voice neutral, though inside he burned with the unfairness of it all. Markham still didn't understand, or didn't want to understand, what he'd tried to do to those women. "Get on the truck," Markham said finally. "But remember this, the Army has a long memory, and so do I." Coleman saluted crisply, a final small defiance in its perfect execution, then turned and climbed into the truck, where his squad waited. As the vehicle rumbled to life, he caught a glimpse of the compound gate swinging open, and beyond it, the jungle-lined road that would take them back to their unit. None of them spoke as the truck pulled away. They'd escaped court-martial, at least for now, but Markham's words hung over them like a storm cloud. The Army indeed had a long memory, and men like Harding and Markham held grudges. After they'd been traveling for about 20 minutes, Jones finally broke the silence. "You think the lieutenant meant that? About remembering?" "He meant it," Coleman confirmed. But there's nothing we can do about that now, except do our jobs and watch each other's backs. The men nodded, understanding the unspoken message. The war against the Japanese continued, but they now face enemies within their own ranks as well. What about the women? Richards asked. And Lieutenant Garner? Medical transport left before us, Coleman told them. They're on their way to the base hospital. He didn't add his concern about what might happen after that, whether Harding's influence might still reach them, whether they'd truly receive the care they needed. The truck jolted over the rutted jungle road, throwing them against each other with every bump and turn. Despite the discomfort, Coleman felt a weight lifting as they put distance between themselves and the intelligence compound. Whatever came next, at least they were together, and they were returning to duty rather than facing confinement. After nearly 3 hours of rough travel, the truck slowed as they approached a forward base area, a collection of tents and temporary structures carved out of the jungle. Coleman recognized it as their regiment's current headquarters. The familiar sight of the 93rd Infantry Division's vehicles and equipment brought a sense of returning home, however temporary that home might be. The truck stopped outside the command tent. As the squad climbed down, stiff from the long ride, a staff sergeant approached. "Sergeant Coleman?" "Captain Wilson wants to see you and your men immediately." Coleman nodded, brushing dust from his uniform. Captain Wilson was their company commander, a fair-minded officer who'd always treated the colored troops under his command with professional respect, if not warmth. The captain sat behind a field desk in the command tent, maps spread before him, radio equipment buzzing softly in the corner. He looked up as Coleman's squad filed in, his expression unreadable. "Sergeant," he acknowledged, "I've received some interesting reports about you and your men." "Yes, sir," Coleman said. "We're prepared to explain our actions." Wilson waved this away. "Colonel Reynolds already provided a full account. Sit down, all of you." The squad found seats on folding chairs and empty crates. Wilson studied them for a moment, then leaned forward. "I want to be clear about something," he said. "What happens in this tent stays in this tent. Understood?" "Yes, sir," they responded in unison. Wilson nodded. "Good. Because officially, I'm going to tell you that refusing a direct order, regardless of the circumstances, was wrong. That you're lucky to have escaped court-martial, and that any further incidents will result in severe disciplinary action." He paused, making eye contact with each man in turn. "Unofficially, Lieutenant Markham was out of line. What he tried to do to those women through you was disgraceful." The squad exchanged surprised glances. They hadn't expected this level of understanding, especially not from an officer. "That said," Wilson continued, his tone hardening, "you've created a complicated situation. Markham has friends in division headquarters. So does Colonel Harding. They're not going to forget this." "We understand, sir," Coleman said. "I don't think you do," Wilson replied, echoing Harding's earlier words, but with concern rather than menace. "They're already pushing for your squad to be broken up. Reassignments to different units across the division." A tense silence fell over the tent. This was the punishment they'd feared most. Separation from the men they trusted with their lives. "Can they do that, sir?" Washington asked, his young voice tight with worry. "They can and they might," Wilson answered bluntly. "I'm fighting it, but with combat operations ongoing, I may not have much say. We need every able body on the line." Coleman's mind raced. Being separated would leave them vulnerable, easy targets for retribution. "Is there anything we can do, sir?" Wilson sighed heavily. "Keep your heads down. Do your jobs exceptionally well. Give them no further reason to single you out." He shuffled papers on his desk. "For now, you'll resume normal duties with your platoon. Lieutenant Foster will be taking over from Markham." Relief rippled through the squad. Foster was a recent replacement, but had shown himself to be competent and level-headed in their brief interactions. "Thank you, sir," Coleman said. Wilson looked up sharply. "Don't thank me yet, Sergeant. I may not be able to protect you if Harding and Markham push hard enough." He stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "Dismissed. Report to Lieutenant Foster for assignments." As they filed out of the tent, Richards nudged Coleman. "That went better than I expected." "Don't get too comfortable," Coleman warned. "Captain's right. This isn't over." They found Lieutenant Foster at the supply tent, organizing equipment for an upcoming patrol. The young officer greeted them with visible relief. "Sergeant Coleman, good to have you back. We're short-handed with the new push toward the mountain passes." "Ready for duty, sir," Coleman replied. "What's our assignment?" Foster unfolded a map on a nearby crate. "Recon patrol, leaving at 0600 tomorrow, 10 miles north along this ridge. Reports of Japanese observation posts in these hills." He traced a line with his finger. "Pretty routine, but stay alert. They've been more active since we took the valley." Coleman studied the map, mentally plotting routes and potential trouble spots. It felt good to focus on the familiar work of soldiering, to set aside for a moment the political complications they'd stumbled into. "We'll be ready, sir," he assured Foster. The rest of the day passed in preparation, cleaning weapons, checking gear, reviewing patrol routes. The squad worked with the quiet efficiency of experienced soldiers, finding comfort in the routine. Other platoon members stopped by, curious about their return, but careful not to ask too many questions. Word had spread about their confrontation with Markham, though the details remained murky. As evening approached, Coleman sat outside their tent, breaking down his rifle for a final cleaning before tomorrow's patrol. Richards joined him, cigarette dangling from his lips as he worked on his own weapon. "Been thinking, Sarge," Richards said quietly. "About the women, Lieutenant Garner. I know they're at the hospital now, but—" He hesitated. "Harding's still got influence. What if he tries to get to them somehow? Take them back for intelligence purposes or something?" Coleman's hand stilled on his rifle. The same concern had been nagging at him all day. "Not much we can do about that from here." "Maybe there is," Richards countered. "What if we write down everything that happened, get statements from everyone in the squad, send it up the chain to whoever's investigating Harding?" Coleman considered this. It was a small action, but it might help create a paper trail that would make it harder for Harding to retaliate against the women or Garner. "It's not a bad idea," he admitted, "but we'd need to be careful how we do it. Official channels might bury it if Harding has the influence we think he does." Richards nodded. "We could try to get it directly to Colonel Reynolds. He seemed to be on our side." "Well, I'll think about it," Coleman promised. "Let's focus on tomorrow's patrol first, one fight at a time." But as darkness fell over the camp, Coleman couldn't shake the feeling that the women's safety and their own hung by a very thin thread. The next 3 days passed in the exhausting routine of combat operations. Coleman's squad completed their reconnaissance patrol without incident, returning with valuable information about Japanese positions in the northern hills. They were immediately assigned to a security detail, then another patrol deeper into contested territory. The work was demanding but familiar, and Coleman was grateful for it. In the field, they were soldiers first, their skin color and recent troubles momentarily set aside in the shared purpose of the mission. Lieutenant Foster treated them fairly, and the rest of the platoon seemed to have accepted the story that Markham had been reassigned due to command restructuring. On their 4th evening back, Coleman sat with Richards outside their tent, enjoying a rare moment of downtime. The jungle night hummed around them, punctuated by distant artillery flashes that briefly illuminated the horizon. "Mail came in while we were on patrol," Richards said, holding up several letters. "Got one from my sister in San Francisco." Coleman nodded, though his own mailbag had been empty again. Letters from home came sporadically to the colored units, often delayed for weeks or lost entirely. Richards opened his letter, reading silently for a few minutes. His expression gradually darkened. "Everything okay?" Coleman asked. Richards folded the letter carefully. "My grandmother died. In Manzanar, the internment camp." "I'm sorry," Coleman said softly. "She was 83. Heart gave out, my sister says." Richards' voice was flat. No proper doctor in the camp, just an army medic who didn't care much about an old Japanese woman. Coleman had no words. What could he say to make that right? "You know what I keep thinking about?" Richards continued, staring at the distant artillery flashes. Those 5 women, how they looked at us like we were their enemy. Then realized maybe we weren't. He shook his head. My grandmother never got that moment, just locked away like she was dangerous after 40 years in America. Coleman placed a hand on Richard's shoulder. We did right by those women. Maybe it's a small thing in this whole big war, but it mattered. Richards nodded slowly. I still think we should write down what happened. Send it to Colonel Reynolds or whoever's investigating Harding, for the record. I've been thinking about that too, Coleman admitted. He'd spent his spare moments, few as they were, considering how best to document their experience without appearing insubordinate. We'd need to be careful. Stick to facts. No accusations. Just what we saw and did. The guys would do it, Richards said confidently. All of them. Before Coleman could respond, a runner approached their tent. Sergeant Coleman, Captain wants to see you. Just you, he added when Richards started to rise. Coleman exchanged a concerned glance with Richards, then followed the runner to the command tent. Inside, Captain Wilson sat with Lieutenant Foster and a staff sergeant Coleman didn't recognize. Their expressions were grave. Sergeant, Wilson gestured to an empty chair. Sit down. Coleman sat, sensing bad news in the air. Sir? Wilson sighed heavily. I've received new orders from Division. Effective immediately, your squad is being broken up for operational necessities. Though Coleman had feared this might happen, the reality still hit him like a physical blow. All of us, sir? Jones and Taylor are being transferred to Baker Company, Washington and Miller to Fox. Richards stays here, but moves to Lieutenant Parker's platoon. Wilson's expression showed his displeasure with the orders. You're being assigned as a training NCO at Division Headquarters. A training position, away from combat, away from his men. It was both a promotion and a punishment, designed to isolate him from the soldiers who had stood with him against Markham. When, sir? Coleman managed to ask. Transport leaves at 0600. I'm sorry, Coleman. I fought this, but it came with too much weight behind it. Coleman nodded, understanding the unspoken message. Harding and Markham had pulled strings, using their influence to separate the troublemakers. What about our current operations, sir? We're in the middle of... I'm aware, Wilson cut him off. That argument was overruled. This comes directly from Colonel Brayer's office. The division commander himself had signed off on this. There would be no appeal. May I inform my men, sir? Of course. I suggest you do so immediately. They'll need to prepare for morning transport. Wilson stood, officially ending the meeting, but then added more quietly. This isn't right, Sergeant, but it's how the game is played at this level. Coleman left the command tent, his mind racing. Breaking up the squad wasn't just about punishment, it was about silencing them, ensuring no cohesive account of what happened with Markham and the women could emerge. He found his men gathered around their tent, Richards having already alerted them that something was happening. Their faces fell as Coleman delivered the news. They can't do that, Washington protested, his young face flushed with anger. We're a team. They can and they are, Coleman replied gently. Orders come from Division. Effective tomorrow morning. The men exchanged dismayed glances. Jones cursed softly. Miller shook his head in disgust. This is Harding, Richards said. Has to be. Getting back at us the only way he can. Coleman didn't disagree, but he kept his voice level. Regardless of who's behind it, these are our orders. We follow them like soldiers. And the women? Taylor asked. What happens to our plan to document everything? To help them? It was the question Coleman had been wrestling with since hearing the news. With the squads separated, any coordinated effort would be nearly impossible. We do it tonight, he decided. Each of you writes down exactly what you saw, what you did, what you heard. Stick to facts. I'll collect the statements before transport arrives. The men nodded, determination replacing some of their dismay. What then? Jones asked. Who do we send them to? Coleman considered. I'll be at Division Headquarters, closer to where decisions are made. I'll find a way to get them to Colonel Reynolds or whoever's handling the investigation into Harding. If there even is an investigation, Miller said darkly, "There is," Coleman assured him, with more confidence than he felt. Reynolds wasn't just talking. He saw what Harding was doing and didn't like it. The squad dispersed to begin writing their statements, using precious paper from letters and notebooks. Coleman sat alone for a moment, trying to process how quickly things had changed. Just days ago, they'd faced possible court-martial. Now they were being scattered across the division, alive and in uniform, but separated from the men they trusted most. As night deepened, the statements took shape. Each man brought his completed account to Coleman, handwritten pages detailing the discovery of the women, Markham's order, their refusal, and the aftermath. No embellishment, no accusations, just the plain facts of what had occurred. Richards was the last to finish, adding details of his conversations with the women that none of the others could provide. As he handed over his pages, he hesitated. "Sarge, I've been thinking. What if we send a copy of these to Lieutenant Garner, too? She might be able to use them to protect the women." Coleman nodded slowly. "Good idea. But how do we get them to her? We don't even know where she is now." "Medical dispatch," Richards suggested. "I know a guy in communications. If we address it to her through official channels, marked medical, it might get through." It was risky. Their statements might be intercepted, used as evidence of continued insubordination. But the alternative was doing nothing while Harding potentially regained control of the women's fate. "Do it," Coleman decided. "Make a second copy of everything. We'll send one to Garner, one I'll take to headquarters." The men worked late into the night, copying their statements by the dim light of sheltered candles. By midnight, 2 complete sets were ready. Simple, truthful accounts of what they had witnessed and done. No heroics, no accusations, just facts that might help protect 5 women who had already suffered too much. As the squad finally settled for what little sleep they could get before morning, Coleman sat outside the tent, the precious papers secured in his pack. The night was clear, stars bright against the jungle canopy. Somewhere miles away, Lieutenant Garner was caring for the women. Somewhere, Colonel Harding was plotting his next move. And tomorrow, Coleman's squad, his family in this foreign war, would be scattered like leaves in the wind. He thought about writing a letter home, telling his mother what had happened. She had worried about the army changing him, breaking his spirit. Instead, he had found his true strength here, not in following orders blindly, but in knowing when to stand for something greater. With that thought holding back the weight of tomorrow's separation, Coleman finally closed his eyes to sleep. Dawn broke with the usual cacophony of a military camp awakening, vehicles rumbling to life, mess kits clattering, officers shouting orders that echoed between the tents. Coleman and his squad were already up, packs ready, a strange quiet hanging over them as they prepared for separation. They gathered one last time outside their tent, a tight circle of men who had faced combat and moral choices together. No one seemed eager to speak first. "I asked around about the women," Richards finally said. "Communications clerk says they're at the 121st Evacuation Hospital near San Fernando. Lieutenant Garner's still with them." Coleman nodded, relieved to know they were still under Garner's protection. "That's good news." "I got the statements packaged up," Richards continued. "Addressed to Garner through medical channels. Should go out with today's dispatch." "Well done," Coleman said. Washington, the youngest, looked around at the others with undisguised sadness. "Never thought they'd split us up like this." "It's what they do," Jones replied bitterly. "Can't have colored boys standing together too long. Might get ideas above our station." "That's enough of that," Coleman said firmly. "We're soldiers. We follow orders, even when we don't like them. You all go to your new units and do your jobs the way you've been trained. Make me proud." Taylor managed a small smile. "Like we could do anything else after serving under you, Sarge." A transport truck rumbled toward their area, followed by a jeep. Time was up. "One more thing," Coleman said quickly. "Watch your backs, all of you. Markham and Harding still have friends in this division. Don't give anyone reason to single you out." The men nodded, understanding the warning. Their stand against Markham had marked them. They would need to be twice as careful, twice as good as the white soldiers around them. "Mail going out today?" Coleman asked Richards, who nodded. Good, I'll try to write when I can. Let you know if I learn anything about the investigation or the women. The truck stopped nearby. A corporal stepped down, clipboard in hand. Jones and Taylor for Baker Company, Washington and Miller for Fox. That's us, Jones confirmed, shouldering his pack. The squad looked at each other one last time. Then, in a movement that surprised Coleman, they formed a line and each man saluted him formally. Been an honor, Sergeant, Miller said. Coleman returned the salute, throat tight. Honor's been mine. Stay safe out there. They climbed aboard the truck one by one, a last nod or pat on the shoulder their only goodbye. Richards, who would remain at the base, but in a different platoon, was the last to leave. I'll keep an ear out, he promised quietly. Let you know if I hear anything about Garner or the women. Appreciate that, Coleman said. Take care of yourself, Richards. After Richards walked away toward his new assignment, Coleman stood alone, watching the truck disappear down the muddy camp road. The Jeep driver approached. Sergeant Coleman, I'm your transport to division headquarters. Coleman nodded, picking up his pack. The drive would take several hours through territory still contested in places. He welcomed the time to think, to plan his next steps. As they passed through the camp gate and onto the jungle road, Coleman felt the weight of all he was leaving behind. The front-line combat, where a man's worth was measured by his actions, not his color. The squad that had become his family. The simple clarity of knowing who the enemy was. At division headquarters, the lines would be blurred. The enemies might wear the same uniform as he did, and he would be alone. The journey took nearly 4 hours over rutted roads that wound through jungle-covered mountains. Twice they passed infantry units moving toward the front, white soldiers who barely glanced at the colored sergeant in the passing jeep. Once they stopped at a checkpoint, while artillery boomed in the distance. A reminder that the war continued regardless of personal dramas. Division headquarters was a sprawling compound of tents and prefabricated buildings, set in a valley that had been cleared of jungle. It was a different world from the front lines. Jeeps with polished surfaces instead of mud-splattered frames, officers with clean uniforms, the constant click of typewriters instead of rifle fire. The driver stopped outside a large tent marked Personnel Assignment. They're expecting you inside, Sergeant, he said, already turning the Jeep around for his return journey. Coleman straightened his uniform, adjusted his cap, and stepped into the tent. A white staff sergeant sat at a desk, papers spread before him. Sergeant Coleman reporting as ordered, Coleman announced. The staff sergeant looked up, his expression carefully neutral. Yes, you've been assigned to training section. Captain Morris is expecting you. He handed Coleman a map of the compound with a building circled in red pencil. Report there immediately. Thank you, Coleman said, taking the map. One question, if I may. Where would I find Colonel Reynolds, Medical Corps? The sergeant's eyebrows rose slightly. Medical headquarters is on the east side of the compound. But Colonel Reynolds shipped out 2 days ago. Reassignment to the European theater. Urgent request, apparently. Coleman felt as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. Reynolds gone? Their strongest ally, the one man with enough rank to challenge Harding, had been removed from the equation. I see, he managed to say. Thank you. Outside, Coleman studied the map, mind racing. Reynolds' sudden transfer couldn't be coincidence. Someone, Harding, or someone supporting him, had enough influence to have a full colonel reassigned to another theater of operations. The implications were chilling. With Reynolds gone, who would continue the investigation into Harding's methods? Who would protect Lieutenant Garner and the women? The statements Coleman carried felt suddenly inadequate against the forces now aligned against them. He found the training section building, a long, low structure with a covered porch where several officers stood smoking and talking. Inside, he reported to an administrative clerk who directed him to Captain Morris's office. Captain Morris was a barrel-chested man with graying hair and a perpetual frown. He looked up from his desk as Coleman entered. Sergeant Coleman, right on time. He gestured to a chair. Sit. Coleman sat back straight, cap on his knee. Morris studied a file open before him, Coleman's service record presumably. "You've been assigned to my section to assist with training new replacements," Morris said without preamble. "Specifically, jungle warfare tactics and small unit operations." He looked up, eyes sharp. "Your combat record is excellent. Commendations from 2 separate actions. That's why you're here." Coleman nodded, though he knew perfectly well that his combat record wasn't the real reason for his assignment. "Thank you, sir," he said. Morris closed the file. "Let me be direct, Sergeant. I know about the incident with Lieutenant Markham. I know why you've been reassigned here rather than continuing with your unit." Coleman remained silent, waiting. "I don't care," Morris continued bluntly. "I need experienced NCOs who can train these green replacements not to get themselves killed their first week in the jungle. That's my only concern. Whatever happened with Markham and Colonel Harding is not my business unless you make it my business. Understood?" "Yes, sir," Coleman replied, surprised by the captain's candor. "Good. You'll be working with 3 other training sergeants. Schedules posted on the bulletin board. First group of replacements arrives tomorrow." Morris stood, indicating the meeting was over. "Quarters are in Barrack C, colored NCO section." Even here, segregation remained. Coleman wasn't surprised, just weary of the constant reminder of his place in the Army's hierarchy. "One more thing," Morris added as Coleman reached the door. "Mail is monitored at division headquarters. All of it, incoming and outgoing. Just so you're aware." The warning was clear. Whatever Coleman might write to his former squad members, or they to him, would be read by others. Communication would need to be careful, circumspect. "Understood, sir. Thank you." Outside, Coleman made his way to Barrack C, finding the colored section, a partitioned area at the far end with 6 cots, currently unoccupied. He chose one near the window, set down his pack, and sat heavily on the thin mattress. Reynolds gone. His squad scattered. Mail, monitored, and somewhere Colonel Harding was still operating, perhaps already working to regain control of the women or silence Lieutenant Garner. Coleman felt more alone than he had since leaving Georgia for Army training. But as he unpacked his few possessions, his hand brushed against the packet of statements, the true account of what had happened with Markham and the women, written in his men's own words. Perhaps Reynolds was gone, but there had to be others at division headquarters who would care about the truth. Coleman just needed to find them, and find a way to get the statements into their hands without alerting Harding's allies. As evening approached, he walked through the headquarters compound, familiarizing himself with the layout. The mess hall, the hospital section, the various administrative buildings, all potential places to find help, or at least information about the women and Lieutenant Garner. In the officers' mess hall, where Coleman delivered a message from Captain Morris, he overheard a conversation between 2 medical corps captains. "Quite an uproar at the 121st, one was saying. Colonel Harding trying to reclaim those Japanese women for further questioning, and that colored nurse lieutenant refusing to release them. Garner, right?" the other asked. "Heard she's got backing from someone at division. Otherwise, Harding would have steamrolled her by now." "Won't last," the first predicted grimly. "Harding's got too much pull, and with Reynolds gone." They moved out of earshot, leaving Coleman with both concern and a flicker of hope. Garner was still protecting the women, still fighting. And she apparently had some support at division level, though Reynolds' departure had weakened her position. Coleman returned to the barracks, mind working on a new plan. If he could identify Garner's supporter at division, perhaps that person could help ensure the statements reach the right hands. As he lay on his cot that night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of headquarters, typewriters still clicking in nearby offices, staff cars coming and going, the distant thump of artillery that never quite stopped, Coleman thought of the women in their hospital beds, of Garner standing guard over them, of his scattered squad facing their new assignments. So many lives changed by one moment of moral choice. One refusal that had seemed so clear, so necessary at the time. He didn't regret it, couldn't regret doing what was right, but the consequences continued to ripple outward, touching everyone involved. Tomorrow, he would begin training replacements, young men heading toward combat with no idea of the moral complexities awaiting them beyond the battlefield. Coleman would teach them how to survive in the jungle, how to fight, how to come home alive. But he wondered if anyone could teach them how to hold on to their humanity in the process. That, he was learning, was the hardest battle of all. The next week passed in a blur of training routines. Coleman worked from dawn until dusk with groups of replacement soldiers, mostly young, mostly frightened behind their bravado, all desperately in need of the jungle warfare skills he could teach them. Captain Morris left Coleman largely to his own devices, concerned only that the training was thorough and effective. The 3 other training sergeants, all white, maintained a professional distance, neither friendly nor hostile. They respected Coleman's combat experience, but kept conversations strictly about training matters. At night, Coleman wrote careful letters to his scattered squad members. Knowing the mail was monitored, he kept his messages simple and positive, asking about their new assignments, offering encouragement, avoiding any mention of Markham, Harding, or the women. He hoped they would understand his caution and respond in kind. On his 8th day at division headquarters, a response came from Richards. The letter appeared ordinary, full of complaints about his new platoon lieutenant and questions about headquarters life. But tucked between mundane paragraphs was the information Coleman had been waiting for. Remember that nurse who helped Johnson when he had jungle rot? Heard she's still at the field hospital with those locals we met. Some colonel keeps trying to transfer them elsewhere, but a Major Davis from medical administration won't sign off. Quite a standoff from what I hear. Major Davis, a name, someone at division who was blocking Harding's attempts to regain control of the women, someone who might be willing to help. Coleman carefully destroyed the letter after memorizing the key information. His next challenge was to locate Davis without drawing attention to his interest. The opportunity came 2 days later. Captain Morris assigned Coleman to escort a group of training documents to the medical administration building, a routine courier task that wouldn't raise suspicions. The building was busy with medical staff coming and going, most too preoccupied to notice a colored sergeant with a document pouch. Coleman delivered the papers to the front desk, then casually asked the clerk, "Is Major Davis available?" Captain Morris mentioned he might have additional training requirements for combat medics. The clerk, a harried corporal juggling multiple tasks, barely looked up. "Second floor, end of the hall, but he's in meetings most of today." Coleman thanked him and headed upstairs, heart pounding slightly. He hadn't expected it to be this easy to locate Davis, but headquarters efficiency had worked in his favor. The second floor was quieter, with offices lining a central hallway. At the end, a door stood open, revealing a cluttered office where a major with silver-rimmed glasses sat reviewing documents. The nameplate on the door read, "Major H. Davis, Medical Administration." Coleman knocked on the doorframe. The major looked up, surprise crossing his features at seeing a colored sergeant at his door. "Yes, can I help you, Sergeant?" "Major Davis? Sergeant Isaiah Coleman, Training Section. I was hoping for a moment of your time, sir." Davis gestured to the chair across from his desk. "What can medical administration do for training? Need more realistic wound simulations?" His tone was friendly but professional. Coleman sat, gathering his thoughts. This would require careful handling. "Actually, sir, I'm here about Lieutenant Garner and the Japanese women under her care at the 121st Evacuation Hospital." Davis's expression changed instantly, wariness replacing casual interest. He stood and closed his office door, then returned to his desk. "How are you involved with that situation, Sergeant?" His voice had lost its friendly edge. "My squad found those women, sir. We were the ones who refused Lieutenant Markham's order to strip in front of them. The incident that led to Colonel Harding's involvement." Understanding dawned in Davis's eyes. "You're that sergeant, the one who stood up to Markham." "Yes, sir." Davis studied him for a long moment. "You're taking a risk coming here, Sergeant. That situation has become politically complicated. I understand, sir, but I've brought something that might help. Coleman removed the packet of statements from inside his jacket. These are sworn accounts from every member of my squad, detailing exactly what happened with Lieutenant Markham and the women. Davis didn't immediately take the offered papers. Colonel Reynolds was handling this investigation before his sudden transfer. With him gone, I'm not sure what can be done. Was it really a coincidence, sir? His transfer right after he suspended Colonel Harding? Davis sighed, removing his glasses to rub the bridge of his nose. Nothing happens by coincidence at this level, Sergeant. Reynolds stepped on powerful toes. The transfer was a message to anyone else thinking of interfering with Intelligence Section's methods. Like you, sir? Coleman asked quietly. A thin smile crossed Davis's face. I'm just a medical administrator, ensuring proper protocols are followed for civilian detainees with health concerns. Nothing more. But his eyes told a different story. Davis was deliberately standing in Harding's way, using medical regulations to protect the women, and risking the same fate as Reynolds. These statements could help, sir, Coleman pressed. They document the women's condition when we found them, their treatment by Lieutenant Markham, their fear. All facts, no accusations. Davis finally took the papers. I'll review them, but I can't promise anything, Sergeant. The tide is turning against us. Harding has powerful allies who believe that anything is justified in the name of intelligence gathering. What about Lieutenant Garner, sir? Is she safe? For now, she's officially under my command, which gives her some protection. But Harding is persistent. He's filed multiple requests to have the women transferred to his facility for continued interrogation. Davis's distaste for the euphemism was evident. So far, I've blocked them on medical grounds, but that won't work forever. Coleman leaned forward. Sir, these women were victims of the Japanese military. They were abandoned, abused, traumatized. They're not combatants or spies. They have no military information to give. I know that, Davis said wearily. Lieutenant Garner has made that abundantly clear in her reports. But Harding doesn't care. To him, they're just potential intelligence sources, or worse, objects to be used to demonstrate his authority after being challenged. The implication was clear. Harding's pursuit of the women had become personal, retribution for being questioned, for having his methods scrutinized. What can I do to help, sir? Coleman asked. Davis considered him carefully. Nothing official, Sergeant. You're already on thin ice after the incident with Markham. Any overt action would likely result in your court-martial. He tapped the statements. But unofficially, keep documenting. Keep the truth alive. Is there anyone else at Division who might help? Someone with enough authority to challenge Harding. Colonel Reynolds was our best hope, Davis admitted. But there's General Mitchell, the assistant division commander. He's a by-the-book officer with a strong sense of proper procedure. If these statements and Garner's medical reports reach him directly, bypassing the usual channels where Harding's allies might intercept them, he left the thought unfinished. Coleman understood. Davis couldn't be seen directly challenging Harding, but he was suggesting a path forward. Thank you, sir, Coleman said, standing. I appreciate your time. Davis nodded, tucking the statements into his desk drawer. I never saw these, Sergeant. We never had this conversation. Clear? Crystal clear, sir. As Coleman turned to leave, Davis added, the women are doing better. Physically, at least. Garner's a good officer, dedicated. They trust her. I'm glad to hear that, sir. Outside the medical administration building, Coleman felt simultaneously encouraged and concerned. He had found an ally in Major Davis, but the situation was more precarious than he'd realized. With Reynolds gone and Harding pressing hard to regain control of the women, time was running out. The challenge now was reaching General Mitchell without going through channels that Harding monitored, and doing so in a way that wouldn't immediately identify Coleman or Davis as the source, inviting retribution. As Coleman walked back to the training area, the distant rumble of artillery provided a grim reminder that the war continued regardless of their internal struggles. Somewhere in those contested hills, his former squad members were facing combat without him. The thought weighed heavily on his mind. That evening, as Coleman prepared training materials for the next day's session, Captain Morris stopped by his desk. "Good work with the replacements, Coleman," Morris said. "Feedback from the line units says they're arriving better prepared than previous groups." "Thank you, sir," Coleman replied, grateful for the rare compliment. Morris lingered, seemingly wanting to say more. Finally, he asked, "You delivered those documents to medical administration today?" Coleman tensed slightly. "Yes, sir, as ordered." "Spend much time there?" "Just long enough to make the delivery, sir." Morris studied him, expression unreadable. "Division's a small place, Coleman. People notice where a colored sergeant goes, who he talks to." The warning was clear. Coleman had been observed visiting Davis's office, and someone had reported it. "Understood, sir," Coleman said carefully. Morris nodded once, then turned to leave. At the door, he paused. "Training schedule's changing. You'll be taking a group of Medical Corps replacements tomorrow, 0800 at the South Field." It wasn't a request for confirmation, so Coleman simply said, "Yes, sir." After Morris left, Coleman sat thinking about the interaction. The captain hadn't explicitly forbidden him from visiting medical administration, but the warning was clear. He was being watched. And the sudden assignment to train medical replacements seemed too coincidental. Was Morris helping him or warning him off? Impossible to tell in the complex web of division politics. That night, Coleman wrote another letter to Richards, carefully encoded with information about Davis and the continued standoff over the women. He would mail it in the morning, hoping it would pass the censor's review without raising alarms. As he prepared for bed, Coleman thought again of the women, Emmy, Hatsuko, and the others, now caught in a power struggle between military factions. They had escaped one form of captivity, only to find themselves in another, their fate dependent on the outcome of a battle they couldn't see or understand. The injustice of it burned in Coleman's chest. They had done nothing wrong, committed no crimes. Their only offense was being Japanese women in the path of war, first victims of their own countrymen's cruelty, now pawns in an American power play. Tomorrow he would train medical replacements. Perhaps among them would be someone assigned to the 121st Evacuation Hospital, someone who could carry a message to Lieutenant Garner, bypassing the monitored mail system. It was a slim hope, but at the moment, slim hopes were all Coleman had. The medical replacements arrived at the South Field exactly at 0800. 20 young men in crisp uniforms that hadn't yet seen the jungle's punishing conditions. They formed a ragged line as Coleman approached, some standing at attention while others shifted nervously, unsure of protocol. "At ease," Coleman called. "I'm Sergeant Coleman. Today, you learn how to stay alive in the jungle so you can keep others alive." The replacements relaxed slightly, though many still eyed Coleman with the uncertainty that colored troops often faced from white soldiers who had never served with them. "Medical personnel are priority targets for the enemy," Coleman continued. "They know if they take out the medics, more of our wounded die. So you need to know how to move, how to hide, and how to defend yourselves while performing your duties." For the next 4 hours, Coleman drilled the replacements on jungle movement techniques, camouflage, and basic field medicine under fire. Most were recent arrivals from stateside training who had never experienced anything like the Philippine jungle's challenges. The suffocating heat, disorienting density of vegetation, and constant threat of ambush. During a water break, Coleman circulated among the men, offering individual advice and corrections. He approached a replacement with Lieutenants Bars who had been observing rather than participating, a medical officer rather than an enlisted medic. "Finding the training useful, Lieutenant?" Coleman asked. The young officer nodded. "Very much so, Sergeant. Nothing in medical school prepared me for this environment." "Where are you headed after training, sir?" Coleman kept his tone casual, conversational. 121st Evacuation Hospital, the lieutenant replied. "Surgical unit." Coleman's pulse quickened, but he kept his face neutral. Good unit from what I hear. Lieutenant Garner's there, isn't she? Working with civilian cases? I believe so, the officer said. There's been some talk about her special cases, Japanese women, I think? That's right, Coleman confirmed. My squad found them, actually, before I was transferred to training section. The lieutenant's interest visibly increased. Really? I heard there was some controversy about their handling. Coleman nodded cautiously. There was, still is, from what I understand. The lieutenant glanced around, then lowered his voice. Between us, Sergeant, the medical corps isn't happy with how intelligence has been trying to interfere with patient care. Colonel Harding's methods have raised concerns. This was unexpected, a potential ally appearing out of nowhere. Coleman took a calculated risk. Lieutenant Garner has been protecting those women at considerable personal risk, he said quietly. She could probably use support from another medical officer. The lieutenant studied Coleman's face. You seem personally invested, Sergeant. My squad and I stood up for those women once before, Coleman replied simply. I'd like to know they remain safe. Understanding dawned in the lieutenant's eyes. You're the sergeant from that incident with Markham, the one who refused orders. Coleman tensed, preparing for condemnation, but the lieutenant surprised him. That took courage, he said quietly. Standing up for what's right usually does. Before Coleman could respond, a jeep pulled up at the edge of the training field. Captain Morris stepped out, gesturing for Coleman to join him. Continue the exercise, Coleman instructed the replacements. Practice field dressing techniques as demonstrated. He jogged over to Morris, who stood with his arms crossed, expression grim. Sir, Coleman said, coming to attention. You've been reassigned, Coleman, Morris said without preamble. Effective immediately. Coleman's stomach tightened. May I ask where, sir? Forward Replacement Depot near Baguio. They need experienced NCOs to process new arrivals. Morris handed him a set of orders. Transport leaves at 1400 hours. Coleman scanned the orders, mind racing. The replacement depot was nearly 100 miles north, far from division headquarters, far from any chance of helping the women or Lieutenant Garner. This is rather sudden, sir, he said carefully. Morris's expression softened slightly. It wasn't my recommendation, Coleman. Orders came from higher up. He lowered his voice. Someone wants you away from headquarters. Far away. Harding. It had to be. Somehow he'd learned about Coleman's visit to Major Davis, his interest in the women's situation. I understand, sir, Coleman said, though his mind was already working on what to do next. Permission to complete today's training session. Morris shook his head. Negative. Report to personnel for processing immediately. Lieutenant Chambers will take over the medical replacements. As Morris walked away, Coleman stood still, orders in hand, feeling the ground shift beneath him once more. First his squad scattered, now he himself being removed from any position where he might influence the women's situation. He looked back at the medical replacements, still practicing their field techniques. The young lieutenant who was headed to the 121st met his gaze briefly, a question in his eyes. Coleman could only give a small nod before turning away. At personnel, the processing was swift and impersonal. New orders, travel authorization, updated service record. The clerk, a bored corporal, barely looked up from his typewriter as he handed Coleman the final paperwork. Transport departs from Motorpool in 2 hours. Don't be late. Coleman had just enough time to return to the barracks, pack his few possessions, and write a hurried note to Richards explaining his sudden transfer. He doubted the letter would pass the censors now that he was officially on Harding's radar, but he had to try. As he shouldered his pack and headed for the motor pool, Coleman fought against a growing sense of defeat. He had failed to protect the women beyond his initial stand against Markham, failed to ensure Harding would face consequences for his actions, failed to support Lieutenant Garner in her continued defense of the women. The replacement depot meant isolation from the situation, from any chance of influencing events or even learning their outcome. It felt like exile, which he supposed was exactly the point. The transport was a canvas-covered truck, already half filled with supplies, and a few other soldiers being transferred north. Coleman climbed aboard. Nodding to the others, two white corporals who barely acknowledged his presence, and a colored private who offered a sympathetic smile. As the truck rumbled to life, Coleman caught a glimpse of the medical training field in the distance. The young lieutenant was watching the truck, one hand raised slightly in what might have been a salute. Coleman returned the gesture, a small connection in a situation where connections were being deliberately severed. The journey north would take over a day, with stops at various outposts along the way. Coleman settled in for the long ride, using the time to think. He might be physically removed from the situation, but perhaps there were still ways to help from a distance. The replacement depot would be receiving new troops daily, including, eventually, medical personnel heading to facilities like the 121st. Messages could be passed, information shared. It wasn't much, but it was something. As the truck pulled away from division headquarters, winding its way toward the mountain roads that would take them north, Coleman watched the compound recede in the distance. Somewhere in those buildings, Major Davis still held the squad's statements. Somewhere, decisions were being made about the fate of 5 Japanese women who had already endured more than most could imagine. Coleman hadn't been able to protect them directly, but he had ensured their story was documented, their humanity affirmed on paper if nowhere else. It would have to be enough. The truck hit a pothole, jolting Coleman from his thoughts. The war ground on around them, indifferent to individual struggles for justice or dignity. All anyone could do was make the right choices when those choices presented themselves, then live with the consequences. Coleman had made his choice in that jungle clearing. Whatever happened now, he would not regret it. The replacement depot near Baguio sat on a cleared hillside overlooking a valley where combat operations continued, day and night. From his quarters, Coleman could sometimes see artillery flashes in the distance, hear the muffled crump of explosions carried on the wind. His duties were straightforward, processing new replacements, assigning them to appropriate units based on requirements from the front, ensuring they had proper equipment and basic orientation before sending them forward. It was administrative work, far removed from both combat and the moral complexities he'd faced with Markham and the women. 2 weeks passed, with no word from anyone connected to the situation. Coleman's letters to Richards and his other squad members went unanswered. Whether they were being intercepted or simply delayed in the chaotic military mail system, he couldn't know. He did his job efficiently, earning grudging respect from the depot's white officers who initially viewed his transfer with suspicion. The work itself was monotonous but important. Each replacement, properly equipped and oriented, had a better chance of survival when they reached the front. On a humid afternoon in his 3rd week at the depot, Coleman was processing a group of artillery replacements when a medical convoy pulled into the compound. 3 ambulances and a supply truck, their red crosses dulled with dust from the mountain roads, parked near the mess tent. Coleman continued his work, though he watched the medical personnel disembark with peripheral interest. Any news from other units was welcome in the isolated depot. As the last clipboard was signed and the artillery replacements directed to their temporary quarters, Coleman noticed a nurse stepping down from the lead ambulance. Something in her posture, the confident way she directed the medics unloading supplies, caught his attention. He moved closer, hardly daring to hope. Then she turned, and Coleman felt a surge of recognition and relief. Lieutenant Garner. She looked tired but determined, her uniform showing the wear of field service. She was instructing 2 medics about crates of medical supplies when she glanced up and saw Coleman approaching. Her eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed with caution. "Sergeant Coleman," she said formally, mindful of the others around them. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Transferred 3 weeks ago, ma'am," Coleman replied, matching her professional tone. "May I help with those supplies?" Garner nodded, understanding the offer for what it was, a chance to talk privately. "Yes, thank you. These boxes need to go to the triage tent." "Private, show the sergeant where." The private led Coleman to a large tent being set up on the depot's eastern edge. Inside, medics were arranging cots and equipment, a temporary way station for wounded being evacuated from the front. Coleman set down the medical supplies where directed, then moved back outside. Garner joined him moments later, walking a short distance away from the busy medical team. "This is an unexpected coincidence, Sergeant," she said when they were relatively alone. "Is it a coincidence, ma'am?" Coleman asked quietly. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Perhaps not. When I requested additional medical supplies for a forward evacuation point, I specifically asked to route through this depot. Had a hunch you might be here." "How did you know I'd been transferred?" "Major Davis told me. He also passed along the statements from your squad." Garner glanced around to ensure no one was within earshot. "They've been useful. Documentation matters in these situations." Hope stirred in Coleman's chest. "The women? Are they still under your care?" Garner's expression tightened. "Yes and no. They're still at the 121st, but Harding finally got partial access to them. Limited questioning under medical supervision is how the orders read." "How are they handling it?" "Emmy is strong, a survivor. She protects the others as best she can. Hatsuko's health has improved significantly." "The others?" Garner shook her head. "They're traumatized all over again. Each time Harding's men appear, they believe they're being taken away permanently." Coleman's jaw clenched. "Is there nothing more that can be done?" "Major Davis is still fighting through official channels, but with Reynolds gone and Harding's influence growing, it's an uphill battle." Garner's voice lowered further. "There's something else you should know. Your former squad members, they've all been assigned to high-risk operations, all of them." The news hit Coleman like a physical blow. "Deliberately?" "It appears so. Richards managed to get word to me before his unit moved out. They're being sent on the most dangerous patrols, the most exposed positions." Garner's eyes reflected her concern. "It's not coincidental, Coleman." Harding's reach was longer and more vindictive than Coleman had imagined. Not content with separating the squad and removing Coleman from headquarters, he was now placing the men in harm's way as further punishment for their defiance. "Have there been any?" Coleman couldn't finish the question. "Richards was wounded last week," Garner said softly. "Not seriously. He's recovering at the 121st. The others, I don't know." Coleman closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the information. His men, his responsibility, paying the price for standing with him against Markham. "What about you, ma'am?" he asked. "Are you at risk?" "Always," Garner replied with a thin smile. "But I have some protection through the medical chain of command, and I've been careful to frame everything in terms of medical necessity and proper treatment protocols. Makes it harder for Harding to move directly against me." A call from the triage tent interrupted them. "Lieutenant Garner, we need your expertise on these supply allocations." "Coming," she called back, then turned to Coleman. "I can only stay until tomorrow morning. The convoy returns to the 121st at 0600. "I understand," Coleman said. "Is there anything I can do from here?" Garner considered. "Actually, yes. We're evacuating several wounded from this area back to the 121st. I could use an experienced escort, someone I trust." Her eyes met his meaningfully. "I might be able to arrange a 3-day courier assignment for you." The opportunity was clear. A chance to visit the 121st, to see Richards, perhaps even the women, to gather information that might help their cause. "I'd be honored to assist, ma'am," Coleman said. "I'll speak with your commanding officer. Medical necessity should override any administrative objections." Garner turned to go, then added quietly, "The women still ask about you and your men. You know, especially Emmy. They remember what you did for them." The simple statement affected Coleman deeply. Whatever happened now, whatever consequences they all faced, that moment of human dignity in the jungle clearing had mattered to those who needed it most. "Thank you for telling me that, ma'am." Garner nodded, then hurried back to the triage tent. Coleman returned to his duties, mind racing with this unexpected development. For the first time in weeks, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. If he could reach the 121st, see the situation firsthand, perhaps there was still a way to help. That evening, as Coleman completed paperwork in the depot's administrative tent, the commanding officer, a career major named Whitfield, summoned him. "Coleman," Whitfield said, looking up from his desk, "I've received a request from Medical Corps for you to escort wounded to the 121st Evacuation Hospital tomorrow. Lieutenant Garner specifically requested you due to your combat experience with the 93rd. Coleman stood at attention. "Yes, sir." Whitfield studied him with narrowed eyes. "Seems an unusual request for a specific NCO. Any idea why Lieutenant Garner would ask for you by name?" "We worked together briefly during a field operation, sir," Coleman answered truthfully, if incompletely. Perhaps she remembered I handled evacuation procedures effectively. Whitfield didn't appear entirely convinced, but he nodded. "I'm approving the request. 3-day assignment. 1 day travel there, 1 day for processing, 1 day return. Report to the medical convoy at 05:30 tomorrow." "Thank you, sir." As Coleman turned to leave, Whitfield added, "Coleman, I don't know what happened before you were transferred here, and I don't want to know. You've done good work at this depot. Don't jeopardize that with whatever connection you have to this medical lieutenant." The warning was clear, but so was the implicit permission to proceed. Whitfield, like many career officers, preferred to maintain plausible deniability while allowing his subordinates some flexibility. "Understood, sir," Coleman replied. "Thank you." He spent the evening preparing for the journey, mind focused on what he might accomplish in his brief time at the 121st. At minimum, he could check on Richards, perhaps get updates on the rest of the squad. If possible, he would try to see the women, confirm their condition for himself, and perhaps, with Garner's help, find a way to strengthen the case against Harding's continued interference with their care. The night passed slowly, sleep elusive as Coleman's mind worked through scenarios and possibilities. By 0500, he was ready at the convoy assembly point, watching dawn break over the eastern mountains. Lieutenant Garner arrived promptly at 0530, clipboard in hand as she oversaw the loading of 5 wounded soldiers onto the ambulances. When she saw Coleman waiting, she gave him a professional nod. "Sergeant Coleman, you'll ride in the lead vehicle with me. We have potential security concerns on the route, and I want experienced personnel up front." "Yes, ma'am," Coleman replied, climbing into the passenger seat of the lead ambulance. The driver, a young private, gave him a curious glance but said nothing. As the convoy pulled out of the depot and onto the mountain road, Coleman felt a strange mixture of tension and hope. He was traveling back toward the heart of the situation, toward Richards and the women, toward whatever outcome awaited them all. The end.